case-by-case basis for those fleeing certain totalitarian or communist regimes in our hemisphere. At the same time, it has made clear that our borders are not open and those arriving outside lawful pathways will be sent home. Recent deportation and removal numbers reflect that hard reality for many. Unlike its predecessor, the Biden administration is enforcing border and immigration laws in an orderly, humane way, consistent with precedents set by prior administrations of both parties. Some may not like that, but those are policy differences and nothing more. You don't impeach a cabinet secretary because you don't like their policies, and you certainly don't impeach a cabinet secretary to appease extreme members of your political party. Secretary Mayorkas is fulfilling his duty under the law and to the American people. If the Republican majority doesn't like what he's doing, they should work with Democrats to pass bipartisan border security and immigration reform legislation. Apparently, they prefer political theater and sloppy, inaccurate, quote-unquote report instead. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted to the record, and I'd like, without objection, to enter into the record the DHS order of secession, which shows that Mr. Wolf had the authority to serve as Secretary. Without objection, so ordered. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this overdue discussion. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. You're done. Okay. I'd like to now formally introduce the witnesses. Mr. Chad Wolf serves as America First Policy Institute's Executive Director, Chief Strategy Officer, and the Chair for the Center of Homeland Security and Immigration. Prior to joining AFPI, Mr. Wolf was the former Acting Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. During his time at DHS, he successfully navigated numerous global and domestic challenges to the nation's security, including COVID-19, civil unrest, numerous border and immigration crises, historic natural disasters, and threats to global aviation security. Prior to his service as DHS, he spent over 10 years in the private sector, helping clients manage risks, and before that worked here on Capitol Hill. He has received the U.S. Secretary of Transportation 911 Medal, the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Distinguished Service Medal, and the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. Mr. Joe Edlow has an extensive distinguished background in immigration policy. He most recently served as Acting Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Prior to that position, he served as the Chief Counsel for USCIS. Before his time at USCIS, Mr. Edlow worked on immigration issues in various capacities under the Trump administration, including with the Executive Office of the President and the Justice Department's Office of Legal Policy. He served from 2008 to 2015 as Assistant Chief Counsel for the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He possesses significant experience on Capitol Hill as well, including stints with the House Judiciary Committee and former Representative Raul Labrador of Idaho. Mr. Rodney Scott is a law enforcement officer and the former Chief of the United States Border Patrol, where he served from January 2020 to August 2021 under both President Trump and President Biden. Scott has served in the Border Patrol and CBP since 1992. Throughout his career, Mr. Scott held roles such as Assistant Chief in CBP's Office of Anti-Terrorism in Washington, D.C., as well as the Division Chief and Director for the Incident Management and Operations Coordination Division at CBP headquarters. Ms. Eleanor Acer is a Senior Director for Refugee Protection at Human Rights First, where she oversees Human Rights First's research and advocacy on issues relating to refugee protection, asylum, and the human rights of migrants. Ms. Acer served on the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration as the Vice Chair of the Refugee Council, USA, from 2006 to 2008, and currently serves on its board. Ms. Acer received her JD from Fordham University School of Law and her BA in History from Brown University. I thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I now recognize Mr. Wolf for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Representative Thompson, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. By any objective measure or metric, the U.S. is facing the worst humanitarian and national security crisis along our southern border in our nation's history. Today's border security system is unrecognizable from the America First policies of the Trump administration or even those in place during previous administrations. In all candor, this is the first administration of either political party to deliberately take steps to diminish the security along our southern border. Here's the situation along the border today. This country has experienced the largest mass-scale catch-and-release policy that has resulted in more than 4.5 million illegal aliens, including 1.5 million known gotaways, being allowed into American communities. That is a population larger than every major U.S. city except for New York City. There have been more than 200 known or suspected terrorists apprehended at the southern border, compared to just 11 during the Trump administration. The border is effectively controlled by the Mexican cartels. Fentanyl is coming across the border in record amounts and is the leading cause of death of young Americans. More migrants have died during their journey than ever before. 380,000 children and counting have been trafficked or smuggled across the southern border and abused physically, mentally, and in some cases sexually along the horrendous journey. In the last 2 years, this administration has lost contact with more than 85,000 children after releasing them to sponsors, many of them unvetted, and tens of thousands of children have been subjected to indentured servitude and harsh forced labor situations. And lastly, we are seeing a concerted effort to facilitate illegal aliens into the country at ports of entry through an unlawful parole program and a CBP-1 app to disguise or otherwise hide the extent of the crisis from the American people. I understand the difficulty and complexity of running the Department of Homeland Security, but it is clear to me and to millions of Americans that this is a crisis by design and one that was avoidable. I'm here today as a veteran of DHS, having served at the department in 2 presidential administrations spanning over 7 years, holding 8 senior-level positions that culminated in serving as the acting secretary, but perhaps most importantly, earning the respect of the department's law enforcement officials along the way. And while I look forward to today's discussion, as you have already heard, some members will choose to attack me because I am critical of the administration's actions surrounding this crisis. This is what you will likely hear. This is what you have heard. They will claim I ignored a subpoena to appear before this committee in 2020. What they have failed to provide you is the relevant context that I gave this committee over 2 months of dates for that hearing and for my availability, and that a hearing was never scheduled, or that it would have been improper for me to testify after President Trump nominated me to be DHS Secretary. They will attack me because of questions surrounding the department's order of succession and how it affected my role as acting secretary, a role that I am very proud of. To the extent they mention policies, they will fixate over a short-lived zero tolerance from 5 years ago while staying completely silent about the historic and ongoing migrant child trafficking crisis facilitated by this administration. The reason we see a border in crisis and chaos is simple. The Biden administration has dismantled all of the proven and effective policies put in place under the last administration. That includes well-known policies like the Remain in Mexico and the asylum cooperative agreements with the Northern Triangle. But it also includes more than 24 lesser-known but effective policies, such as a third country transit asylum bar, a humanitarian asylum review process, a prompt asylum claim review, a regulation to end fake families and the cruel recycling of migrant children, having Border Patrol agents conduct credible fear screenings, internal relocation guidance, expedited removal, ending nationwide catch and release, maxing out ICE detention capacity, and exceeding annual deportation targets. And the list goes on. And every one of those have been torn down. By comparison, this administration has embraced ineffective and unlawful policies that have made American communities dangerous and have enriched the Mexican cartels. These policies include a nationwide catch and release scheme that incentivizes millions and millions of other illegal aliens to enter illegally, a 100-day deportation freeze for all illegal aliens, including criminals, releasing illegal aliens on an honor system to self-report to ICE field offices, exempting 99% of illegal aliens from deportation, the lowest level of ICE detention capacity, the lowest deportations in modern history, terminating Remain in Mexico, and fully exempting children from Title 42. This is dangerous, and this is an inhumane approach that need not occur. The laws did not change between administrations, just the decision by this one not to follow the laws. For the reasons cited here and others I'm happy to discuss, it is my professional opinion that this administration is derelict in its duty to faithfully execute the laws as written and protect American communities. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
I now recognize Mr. Edlow for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to present testimony today regarding the continuing threats to the integrity of our immigration system caused by the Secretary and the Department of Homeland Security's willful disregard of our country's immigration laws. The Biden administration, through the Secretary, has seen fit to ignore the law, instead favoring poorly conceived and poorly executed policy decisions. Actions through executive orders, departmental memos, and rules lay waste to the INA and congressional intent. It has eroded our immigration system and propelled the crisis to current levels. As the chairman said, Section 102 of the INA charges the Secretary of Homeland Security with administration and enforcement of the act, and further vests in the Secretary the power and duty to control and guard the boundaries and borders of the United States against the illegal entry of aliens. The massive number of encounters recorded by CBP and the small number of alien removals by ICE, however, suggest that this Secretary has failed to faithfully execute the laws entrusted to him. Since day one of the administration, the department has taken aggressive action to undermine immigration enforcement. Nowhere is that clearer than Secretary Mayorkas' September 30th, 2021 memorandum outlining the appropriate instances in which DHS was authorized to take action against aliens either unlawfully present or lawfully present but removable. Specifically, Secretary Mayorkas outlined 3 main buckets for removal: threats to national security, threats to public safety, and threats to border security. While in theory this would seem to encompass many aliens, in reality the numerous carve-outs, loose definitions, and required factors for consideration made it nearly impossible for ICE to move forward with most enforcement actions. These poorly defined categories gave even some of the most serious of criminal aliens a free pass in the interest of equity. Let me be clear, there is a time and a place for prosecutorial discretion, which has been recognized by the Supreme Court. However, memos targeted at whole groups and not on a case-by-case basis do not comply with the contours of such discretion. Categorical prosecutorial discretion is not discretion at all. It is instead an effort to undermine the enforcement mechanisms clearly found in the law. The department's failure to enforce the full INA in the name of prioritization and discretion is a dereliction of duty. The rampant parole abuse that we now witness is exactly why Congress saw fit to change the law in 1996. Replacing emergent reasons or for reasons deemed strictly in the public interest with on a case-by-case basis for humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit, Congress signaled its intention to clamp down on the process. It specifically wanted to guard against ad hoc programs meant to supplement existing immigration programs. Regardless of the plain language as it currently stands, parole has become a favorite tool of the administration. While first used as an alternative to detention, parole programs have subsequently played a large role in artificially decreasing border numbers. The expanded categorical parole programs for nationals of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti are wholly unlawful. While certainly the previous administration utilized programs, the number of parolees were a small fraction compared to what we have seen on a monthly basis over the past 2.5 years. I would be remiss if I did not mention the department's regulatory agenda, which seeks to upend the credible fear process in the name of orderly processing. Starting with the presumption that every economic migrant is entitled to protection, in 2022, DHS issued an interim final rule on credible fear screening. Under the new process, a positive credible fear determination by an asylum officer will lead to a non-adversarial asylum interview before another DHS asylum officer. This impermissibly changes the process and undermines congressional action by shifting adjudication authority from DOJ to DHS. Even more concerning, written summary of the original credible fear interview now doubles as an alien's asylum application, rendering moot the requirement that an alien file one at all. This shifts the burden to present and prepare a meritorious claim for protection. While this does not ensure an asylum grant, it certainly provides a path for fraud and renders certain anti-asylum fraud measures moot. A second final rule issued last month appears to be tough on illegal border crossers, making them ineligible for asylum. However, the number of exceptions and the easily rebuttable presumptions belie its stated purpose. This rule will have the opposite effect, as it will ultimately incentivize aliens to make the dangerous trek northward with families in tow. Mr. Chairman, we would not be sitting here today if the Secretary and the Department simply enforced the law as written. Instead, the Department has, in an effort to remove barriers and to create a subjectively orderly system, conflated law and policy and ensured that when the two were in conflict, that policy won the day. A return to the rule of law is the only cure at this point, and it is incumbent upon Congress to use its oversight and lawmaking authority to repair the damage done by the Department. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Edlow. I now recognize Mr. Scott for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, thank you for letting me testify here today. The career professionals at DHS, and specifically Customs and Border Protection and U.S. Border Patrol, deserve our praise and admiration. I am confident that they are doing everything they can every day to protect this country, despite this administration's efforts to undermine their efforts. The chaos at our southwest border and the consequences are a result of actions taken by the Biden administration. The perspectives that I provide are grounded in my professional experience, including my time as chief in the Biden administration. Decades of bipartisan border security improvements were erased on January 20th, 2021, when the Biden administration announced actions that were heard around the world as the U.S. borders are now open. As predicted, the most secure border the U.S. had ever enjoyed disintegrated into chaos. The Biden administration's claims that they inherited a border in shambles, that surges in illegal immigration like this are normal, or that allowing more illegal aliens to go through a port of entry is solving the problem, are not accurate. The crisis at our border is still raging. Don't get lulled into believing that 3,500 arrests a day should be cheered just because it is lower than the 11,000 a day we saw a few weeks ago. The Border Patrol remains overwhelmed. The cartels continue to control who and what is entering the United States. Migrants are still being exploited, and children are still being trafficked. CBP has recorded over 6 million encounters and over 1.4 million known gotaways. That's under the Biden administration. But numbers fail to convey the severity of the national security consequences. Some consequences are easier to measure than others before a bomb goes off. The 1.4 million known gotaways are a measurable consequence of agents being overwhelmed. But consider that hundreds of miles of border lack any persistent surveillance. And when construction of the border wall system was terminated, the associated technology was also terminated. Every minute that agents are not patrolling the U.S. border increases the probability of more unknown gotaways. Most illicit narcotics, including the fentanyl that is readily available in your hometown, originated outside of the United States. Every agent and officer taken away from inspection and patrol duties decreases our nation's ability to interdict these poisons before they can hurt your family, your friends, and your neighbors. Leaving hundreds of miles of border unmanned and unpatrolled is like leaving the doors of your home open when you go on vacation. You can replace things that get stolen, but the real threat is the unknown person hiding in your home when you return. Verifying any unknown person's identity or their story requires a face-to-face conversation. How many human trafficking incidents went undetected because our law enforcement personnel today are being instructed to process aliens like a fast food drive-thru? How do we quantify the intelligence collection opportunities that were lost? Additionally, when CBP officers are redirected to conduct immigration processing, legal trade and travel suffers. This further disrupts our supply chain, increases the cost of imported goods, and more. As Chief of the United States Border Patrol, my staff and I engaged and advised the Biden transition teams well before inauguration. The administration's laser focus on expediting processing and increasing opportunities for migrants to enter the U.S. never wavered. Advice from career professionals was ignored. Policies were implemented that resulted in thousands of aliens being released into the U.S. Illegal immigration intensified, overwhelmed Border Patrol, and effectively transferred control of our southwest border directly to the Mexican drug cartels. This is a national security threat. Cartels use illegal aliens to overwhelm law enforcement, creating controllable gaps in border security. These gaps are exploited to smuggle anything they want into the United States. To think that terrorist networks and hostile nations are not exploiting this vulnerability is naive. I'm not here testifying about policy differences. Policy is how you carry out your duties under the law. The Secretary of Homeland Security has a legal duty to prevent the illegal entry of aliens and to secure our border. Even if success is unattainable, he still needs to try. Instead, Secretary Mayorkas has chosen to expend department resources to provide care for aliens that enter the U.S. illegally. As detailed in my written testimony, I believe the Secretary is derelict in his duties to secure the border, and I also believe that the Secretary has likely violated the Impoundment Control Act. Secretary Mayorkas is great at invoking understandable compassion for the plight of the migrants, and I too acknowledge our humanitarian responsibilities. But as Secretary of the United States Department of Homeland Security and the overseer of billions of tax dollars that are appropriated to protect America, if you look at that, this administration is clearly not doing their job.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I now recognize Ms. Acer for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. Over the last few years, Human Rights First has documented the horrific harms inflicted on people due to the Remain in Mexico and Title 42 policies. I personally witnessed the first days of the implementation of Remain in Mexico from Tijuana under the Trump administration, and the final days of the Title 42 policy from Matamoros and Reynosa last month. My testimony focuses on a few key areas. First, our laws and treaties rightly allow people seeking protection from persecution to seek asylum, and asylum is both morally just and politically popular. Second, not only did Trump administration policies like Remain in Mexico and Title 42 evade and violate refugee law, but they spurred chaos and inflicted massive human suffering. Third, the Biden administration should swiftly end its asylum ban, which endangers the lives of refugees and is inconsistent with the law, as were the Trump administration's bans on asylum. Fourth, as Human Rights First's experts on extremism and anti-Semitism have detailed, rhetoric painting migrants and asylum seekers as threats or invaders fuels white supremacist conspiracy theories and violence. It must be countered. Finally, Congress and the Biden administration should work together to implement effective strategies and provide the necessary resources to address challenges at the border and properly staff safe, effective, fair asylum adjudications. The crisis we're facing is a humanitarian one, and it's global. In my written testimony, I outlined the ways in which human rights situations have deteriorated in countries in the Americas, including Cuba, Guatemala, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, pushing people to flee in search of protection, safety, and stability. The reality is that the vast majority of the world's refugees are hosted by other countries, and here in the Americas, other countries are hosting refugees as well. 6 million of the 7 million Venezuelans who have fled are hosted in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States is more than capable of humanely receiving and fairly processing the claims of people seeking refuge here. Under the Trump administration, Human Rights First tracked 1,544 reports of kidnappings, murder, torture, rape, and other violent attacks against people returned to Mexico under MPP. And during the court-ordered re-implementation of MPP in 2022, asylum seekers continued to be targeted. MPP hearings remained a due process farce. Many asylum seekers were abducted while traveling through border regions to attend hearings or directly outside U.S. ports of entry before or after their hearings. MPP also wasted government resources. DHS's analysis concluded it diverted resources from other migration priorities. In June 2020, the Supreme Court confirmed the DHS secretary had authority to end the policy. Asylum seekers and migrants returned to Mexico under Title 42 similarly suffered kidnappings, rapes, and other attacks. The Trump administration returned well-known political activists from Nicaragua directly back to their country of persecution. Human Rights First has tracked over 13,480 reports of kidnappings, torture, and other attacks against asylum seekers and migrants during the Biden administration. Moreover, far from being an effective border management tool, the policy actually spurred increased crossings between ports of entry, inflated border apprehension statistics, and exacerbated cartel violence. Ending Title 42 does not mean that the U.S. border is open. it means U.S. immigration and refugee law can no longer be evaded by specious invocation of public health authority. The Biden administration has taken important steps towards expanding refugee resettlement from the Americas and some regular pathways to the U.S. through parole. As outlined in my testimony, the Department of Homeland Security has legal authority to parole individuals into the country and legal authority to release people from detention. The use of these legal authorities do not mean the border is open. In conclusion, the Biden administration and Congress should work together to uphold refugee law at U.S. borders. Maximizing asylum at ports of entry after years of blockage is essential to end the counterproductive consequences of Trump policies that restricted and blocked access to asylum at ports of entry and pushed populations to cross between. We should enhance support for refugee hosting capacities in other countries, support for strong asylum systems and reception capacities, ramp up, speed up, and strengthen regional resettlement, improve parole and other safe migration policies, implement humanitarian rather than punitive approaches to refugee protection, and take other steps that I've outlined in detail in my testimony. We also need to press the Biden administration to end its asylum ban and to stop subjecting asylum seekers to fast-track processing in CBP custody, as the Trump administration did. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony, and I now recognize myself for questions. I want to talk about this claim that there's been a 70% decrease, since Title 42 went away. And it looks like they're counting the encounters at 3,500 compared to the peak of 11,000, the actual record number, which happened right before that. But what they're not counting, it's very interesting, I don't know any of the witnesses that can confirm this, but that we're not counting the CBP One app appointments, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That is correct. So the numbers that are being cited by the department are Border Patrol numbers. Those are encounters between ports of entry. So they talk about, I believe, a 70% decrease. What they're not telling you, they're actually capturing the number, but they're not including it in their press release, is the number from OFO, which is the Office of Field Operations. They're at a port of entry, are the number of inadmissibles that are showing up at ports of entry. And what's happening is they're being shifted between the ports of entry to the ports of entry.
It's a shell game, basically. We're taking the numbers out of these and we're not reporting them over here, and we're allowing for appointments to be made through CBP One app, and then saying that that's a lawful mechanism of entry. Mr. Edlow, is that in congruence with the law? Is that a lawful entry just because you fill out an app online?
No, it's not.
So it's a violation of the law.
It's a violation, and frankly, if somebody comes to the port of entry, has no documentation to get in, there is a lawful mechanism for them to claim credible fear and to move through that process, but to just allow them to come in, to parole them, not on a case-by-case basis, I might add, but as a group, is not within the confines of the law.
It's against the laws passed by the United States Congress. Okay, so again, kind of digging into this a little further, this group of, and I think the amount of the appointments are about 1,500 or so a day. Add that to the 3,500, add that to the number that don't schedule an appointment and come through, that we don't know that number because they're not reporting that number. Has there really been an appreciable decrease, in your opinions, since Title 42 went away?
I do not believe that there has been a decrease in the numbers. It is a shell game. And the other thing I want to point out, too, is it's very selective about what day they choose to compare the numbers to. You need to look at a little broader amount of time. The border for my entire career was systematically getting more and more controlled, and we are actually driving those numbers down. You have to look at it longer, not just one day in time.
Mr. Wolf, on May 10th, reporter and immigration analyst Todd Benzman reported ahead of the expiration of Title 42 that Mexican immigration officials were informing him that they were coordinating with DHS personnel on the other side of the border to move illegal aliens from the Mexico side of the Rio Grande to the American side. In other words, they were helping aliens illegally cross into the United States. This would violate, as I understand it, Section 274 of the INA, which prohibits aiding and abetting illegal immigration or helping someone enter the country. In your opinion, would such an intentional coordination on a high-profile stage have been conducted without the approval or foreknowledge of the Secretary of Homeland Security?
No, you would need to have approval up and down the chain of command.
So basically, again, violating the laws of the United States, you think that authority, I mean, the Border Patrol guys would never do that without the authority of the Secretary. Is that what you're saying?
It's hard for me to say whether the chief of the Border Patrol was aware, or whether that made it all the way to the Secretary or not. I'm not there, so I can't testify to that.
I can't imagine they'd willfully break the law without the Secretary giving them approval, but that we'll dig further into that later. The interim final rule that came out, Mr. Edlow, can you discuss a little bit about how this basically upends the entire intent of the laws of Congress from the INA?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. When the Homeland Security Act was signed and enacted in 2002, 2003, most powers that had been exercised by the former INS were moved over to the new DHS, specifically with asylum to USCIS, where asylum officers were conducting interviews. However, after a credible fear interview, the way it always had worked was that the alien would then go before the immigration judge. That powers were never transferred as part of the Homeland Security Act. This rule does shift that authority from DOJ to DHS having a second bite at the apple to
speed people into the country, basically, not have to go through the immigration judge process.
But not only that, sir, but the fact that they do not require a new asylum application really does limit the ability for anyone to assess whether there's a valid claim or not.
My time has expired. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Acer, Republicans have constantly falsely accused Secretary Mayorkas of being derelict in his duty to secure the border, even though, as I said in my opening statement, border encounters have dropped sharply since the Biden administration terminated Title 42 last month. Republicans don't like the Biden administration is returning to a more orderly, humane border and immigration policy after the cruelty and dysfunction of the Trump administration, and they can't stand that these policies have been effective. So we are seeing this political theater play out with the Republican leadership trying desperately to appease its members. My Republican colleagues seem to be particularly upset about the Biden administration allowing people to present themselves at port of entry to seek asylum as provided under the law, just as every other administration had prior to this one. Actually, there seems to be some revisionist history going on because even President Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, Mr. Wolf's former boss, acknowledged, in fact, encouraged migrants to come to ports of entry for processing, saying, and I quote, "So if a migrant comes to a port of entry, they haven't broken any laws." This is exactly why we tried to encourage the migrants to go to a port of entry. The Biden administration is being sued to force it to do more to restore access to asylum after the last administrations effectively cut it off. Now, Ms. Acer, since you are an immigration attorney with vast experience and expertise in this field, I want to talk with you and set the record straight. Claiming asylum at a port of entry is lawful, correct?
Absolutely.
Claiming asylum after being encountered by Border Patrol is lawful too, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Paroling migrants is lawful and within the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security, correct?
Yes, sir.
No administration has ever detained everyone encountered at the border, isn't that right?
That is right.
And that includes the Trump administration, correct?
Absolutely.
So Title 42 caused terrible harm to asylum seekers, which you saw firsthand on your visits to the border. Title 42 was also detrimental to border security, isn't that right?
Absolutely.
Please explain that to the committee.
As I mentioned in my testimony, Title 42 encouraged repeat entries. It did not have immigration consequences. It also pushed populations that used to go and seek asylum at ports of entry to end up having to cross between ports of entry, because not just for weeks, but for months and months and years, there was no way to actually cross the border. The change in numbers we've seen, I believe, is a confirmation of what an absolute disaster Title 42 was from so many ways. Asylum seekers that we met at the border were trying to use the CBP-1 app. And how that works, for those of you who haven't seen it, is people provide information that the government receives and actually reviews in advance. One of our concerns about the CBP-1 app is that it could be used to actually meter and limit the number of asylum seekers allowed to legally seek asylum. In addition, I would say that, we're also concerned about asylum seekers who are trying to approach ports of entry who are not being allowed to do so now, either because of CBP or Mexican government authorities not letting them do so.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'd like to include in the record a GAO decision that Mr. Wolf indeed served in that capacity of secretary illegally. I'd like to also include a review requested by the department and affirmed by GAO again that Mr. Wolf served in that capacity illegally. I'd also like to submit for the record a fellow judge in Maryland also ruled that Mr. Wolf was serving illegally in that position.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
We have an objection.
I object. I don't believe the ranking member was capable of presenting to this committee justification for claiming that Secretary Wolf served illegally. This is not a court of law, it's a committee in Congress. I object to the inclusion in the historical record.
Okay, I think we misunderstood the gentleman's motion. It was not objection to the insertion of the material into the record. It was, I think, just a statement of opinion about. And so ordered. The GAO reports are entered into the record. I now recognize Mr. McCall from Texas, Chairman McCall from Texas, for his 5 minutes question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I served as chairman of this committee for 3 terms now, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Mr. Edlow, good to see you. We worked together on these issues, and Secretary Wolf, Mr. Scott, great state of Texas. And I was a federal prosecutor charged with prosecutions at the border. Political asylum is always the magnet, and it has been abused by the cartels for many years. 85% of these claims are not legit, only 15% are. It's very simple. When they're allowed to enter the United States, because we don't have detention space, they are released into our society. They're given a notice to appear, and they disappear. And I've seen this for 20 years in Congress. In fact, my first bill was to end catch and release, and here we are today with the same program. The Trump administration, through Secretary Wolf, Mr. Edlow, implemented what I thought was a very effective plan called the Migrant Protection Protocols, remain in Mexico. Because they had to remain in Mexico pending their adjudication. If it was legitimate, they were allowed in. If not, they were not allowed into the country. And it brought the numbers down dramatically. So what happened with the Biden administration gets into power? Nearly on day one, Secretary Mayorkas rescinds the order, rescinds migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico. And what has happened since then? Nearly 100,000 young people died in this country due to fentanyls. Enough has been seized to kill billions of people, 5 million encounters, nearly 100 on the terror watch list, which used to frighten me as chairman of this committee when I would hear of anybody on the terrorist watch list getting into the United States of America. There was a court order to force the administration to re-implement MPP. That court order, in my view, has not been fully complied with by this administration. To make things worse, they took the vetting process away from sponsors of these aliens. What has that turned into? Children going to houses, 20, 30 of them, under one sponsor, not vetted, turns into a human trafficking enterprise, a criminal enterprise. Young girls being sex trafficked and young men going to MS-13 as they try to pay back the cartels. Cartels now are in operation control. When I was down at the border after the rescission of MPP, I asked the Chief of Border Patrol, Mr. Ortiz, is there a direct cause and effect between the rescission of this program and what we're seeing at the border, totally out of chaos? He told me the answer was yes. And every Border Patrol officer will tell you that because they live it. In my state, Mr. Scott, as you know, has spent $4.5 billion just this session to deal with this problem, a federal responsibility. So my question is, do you believe, Mr. Wolf, Mr. Scott, Mr. Edlow, that Secretary Mayorkas is responsible for the consequences that followed of the rescission of MPP? And do you believe he is complicit with the consequences of what has happened to this country?
So the answer to that is a resounding yes. Obviously, the Secretary ended MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols, so he's responsible for the actions that follow that. And I would just say, look, at the end of the day, it's okay to claim asylum. What's not okay is to simply be released into the country. Or it's not okay to say that there's an immense amount of fraud in the asylum system. DHS knows that. They have the numbers. We all use the numbers that come from DHS, but they simply put blinders on and say, we're okay with that amount of fraud. It's okay for the American people. That's why we implemented MPP, and we did a number of other things. They're not doing any of that now. So all of the folks that are claiming asylum at ports of entry, again, are being released into American communities. That's not okay.
I agree. Mr. Scott, Mr. Edlow.
I agree fully, and I want to point out, MPP made sure people got due process, but they did not get what they want. Most of these people, from my experience, don't really care about asylum. They don't really care about the legal documentation or process. They want to be released into the United States. Once that was taken away, the flow immediately decreased because they couldn't commit fraud. Everybody knew that. This administration got rid of that program intentionally. They're responsible for the results.
Mr. Edlow.
I also agree, and there's plenty I could say about MPP in terms of where it comes from, in terms of the INA, but I will just say this. When the court initially told the secretary to reinstitute MPP, there was an attempt to do that, a half-hearted attempt to do that, but in the press release that did that, it also made it clear that the secretary had every intention to fight that decision from the court and to take measures to end MPP in other ways. So it was really never an actual attempt to reinstate it.
The gentleman's time has expired. I recognize Mr. Correa of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start out by submitting for the record, without objection, the press release mentioned by Chairman Green, if I may, where it says that there were 10,070 non-citizens processed on an average per day via the CBP One app. I'd like to submit this for record, sir. Without objection. Ms. Acer, does that sound like hiding the data?
No, it's not hiding the data.
I want to show you a quote by Secretary Nielsen, if I may. So we prefer, Mr. Wolf, we prefer people showing up at ports of entry as opposed to between ports of entry? Yes, no?
Absolutely, and I would
Thank
say
you
that that is accurate. What I would say is that the migrants
you,
are not
thank
breaking
you.
the law.
Thank you very much.
DHS is breaking the law with the parole
You got other
program.
people you can address here. I just have 3 minutes left. Ms. Acer, is it legal to come to ports of entry?
Absolutely.
I want to show you a couple of pictures here of the refugee challenge we have in the Western Hemisphere. Tell you, the U.S. is not number one. You've got other countries that have it even worse than we do right now, trying to address this human challenge the world is facing. I'm going to show you also a picture of the Darien Gap and a young girl who's separated from her mother. She's not coming to Disneyland. She's trying to survive. Ms. Acer, let me ask you, did Secretary Mayorkas create the COVID-19 pandemic?
No, sir.
Is he responsible for the unprecedented violence, gang violence, extortions, assaults in Central America?
No, sir.
How about for the ongoing crisis in Haiti?
No.
The economic instability in Venezuela?
No.
Human rights violations in Cuba?
Absolutely not.
Responsible for repression, poverty in Nicaragua?
No.
Instability in Peru?
Nope.
Central American economic crisis?
No, sir.
China's economic challenges?
Absolutely not.
Russian-Ukrainian war and the ensuing refugees from Ukraine and Russia?
No, sir.
African economic instability and food shortages?
No.
America's stunning economic growth, strongest in the world?
No.
Probably not. America's low unemployment rate?
No.
America's insatiable demand for workers, with or without documents?
No.
Responsible for the private sector, farmers, ranchers, hiring of undocumented workers?
No, sir.
Let's just clarify, Ms. Acer. Is asylum legal?
Yes.
Is approaching our ports of entry and asking for asylum, is that legal?
Absolutely.
Is that legal under international law?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I just want to add, the majority party here voted to end the COVID-19 healthcare emergency. And in doing so, you voted to lift Title 42. What was left, Secretary Mayorkas has managed. He enlisted the help of our neighbors. No other time in the history of the U.S. and Mexico have we had such a great working relationship with Mexico and the others through Central and South America on the issue of the refugee crisis. So to say that Secretary Mayorkas has been derelict of his duty is misleading the American people and presenting misleading facts. Ms. Acer, is Mr. Mayorkas lying to the American people?
No, sir, I don't believe, to my knowledge, though I do disagree with him on his asylum ban. I think he is absolutely wrong.
I would probably disagree with him on that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I
Will the gentleman yield? Mr. Correa?
I yield, of course, my
A
30
few
seconds.
seconds. I just want to point out, Mr. Wolf, and all of our witnesses here, you may have a difference of opinion as to how the United States should process our asylum applicants. But the notion that that difference of a policy opinion would be the basis for a quote-unquote case closed that Secretary Mayorkas is violating his duty is preposterous, and it is not any basis for impeachment.
The
I
gentleman's
yield
time
back.
has expired. I now recognize Mr. Higgins from Louisiana for his 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans watching this are listening to the commentary. You'd have to be living under a rock in America to not recognize the disintegration of our sovereignty at the southern border over the last 2 years. Got 6 million illegals processed in some manner into our country, 1.5 million known criminal runner gotaways, and the border law enforcement is so overwhelmed, estimates easily state that that number is doubled of unknown and uncounted criminal runner gotaways. All told, you're talking about 9 million people rolling into our country since President Biden was inaugurated. Secretary Mayorkas' failure is difficult to calculate the impact upon our country, our entire country. Generational trauma the man has brought upon our country. My colleagues across the aisle this is your Baghdad Bob moment, when you witness clearly what the truth is, what everyone across the country recognizes as the disintegration of our southern border and horrific impact upon our country, and yet you drone on and on about how great things are. Blame everything on Trump. Good Lord, for years. And yes, the ranking member has a right to introduce a government study to the record, but the insinuation was that former Secretary Wolf served illegally. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that. Mr. Wolf, I know you very well. Did you serve honorably and legally as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, sir?
I believe I did. I was asked to serve as that acting secretary by the president. I took my oath seriously. I'm very proud of the way that I led the department. Lawyers can argue over the order of succession about the acting secretary before me, but I think what's clear is simply being confirmed doesn't make you capable of doing the job.
Thank you for your response, sir, and I apologize on behalf of the committee for that insinuation. I think it was ugly, it was tainted by agenda, and over the course of the next several months, perhaps they can develop a new script than just attacking the Trump administration, because we're going to expose what has happened to our country over the last 2 years. Mr. Scott, would you explain to the committee in America how Secretary Mayorkas has intentionally shifted migrant numbers through the CBP-1 app to promote the appearance of decreasing illegal crossings?
As we discussed earlier, the numbers that are being reported publicly they're selective. They've been focusing on the southwest border only, and we need to focus on total encounters, or what OFO calls as inadmissibles. If you go onto cbp.gov, their website, it's a nightmare, but you can slowly sort some of this stuff out.
Yes, sir. So to focus on the CBP-1 app, is it true that there's virtually no parameters disqualifying an applicant from applying for parole through the CBP-1 app?
That is my understanding.
That's my understanding as well. Mr. Wolf, in your opinion, sir, is the increased use of the CBP-1 app for parole application consistent with the app's original purpose?
No, not the original purpose.
Would you clarify that for America, please?
Again, it was for forwarders, it was for industry on how to facilitate that trade across the border. It was for boating licenses.
It was for legal commerce, to speed legal commerce through ports of entry, and yet now it's being used for undocumented, legally identified as inadmissible illegal migrants coming through our ports of entry using the CBP-1 app, and they're granted parole. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding of how it's currently being utilized.
And how would that be? Would you clarify how that's in violation of the law?
Well, again, that's not how the CBP-1 app was originally, and again, it's not how you allow individuals to come in, paroling them in. There's so many different exemptions of using that CBP-1 app. If you can't access it, they allow you into the country. And so it's another smoke and mirrors of how to bring in individuals, again, that have no legal right to be into the country, whether you parole them in or put them into the asylum system. The end result is all the same. So we can talk about the different ways. The end result is that they are released into American communities, and that is what's fueling this crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Magaziner for his
Thank you,
5 minutes
Chairman.
question from Rhode Island, by the way.
I have to say, I am getting sick and tired of House Republicans politicizing the Department of Homeland Security. There are common sense bipartisan actions that this committee could be taking up to improve security along the southern border. But instead of advancing smart policies to keep Americans safe, the Republicans have resorted to the type of political theater and Biden bashing that the American people are sick of. We know there are challenges at the border because poverty and political instability are causing millions of people to flee their home countries. But the notion that President Biden or Secretary Mayorkas are guilty of, quote, dereliction of duty are absurd. President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have been proactive in taking steps to protect our homeland. Here are the facts. April 27th, 2021, just 2 months after taking office, Secretary Mayorkas launched Operation Sentinel to combat criminal organizations smuggling migrants across the border. June 7th, 2021, Secretary Mayorkas launched Joint Task Force Alpha to crack down on trafficking groups in Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. November 2021, President Biden's infrastructure bill delivered $430 million to Customs and Border Protection above previously budgeted levels for enhanced security at points of entry. Nearly every House Republican voted no. December 15th, 2021, President Biden signed Executive Order 14060, establishing the U.S. Council on Transnational Organized Crime with a focus on enhancing operational and intelligence capabilities to disrupt transnational crime organizations. In 2022, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats passed a Homeland Security funding measure that added 300 Border Patrol agents and 125 CBP officers. Every House Republican voted no because it had Joe Biden's name on it. In 2023, Secretary Mayorkas launched Operation Blue Lotus and Operation Four Horsemen to disrupt narcotics trafficking at and between points of entry. April 2023, the Biden Justice Department unsealed charges against 28 leaders of the Sinaloa cartel engaged in drug trafficking and other crimes. The list goes on and on. This is just a sample of the actions that the administration has taken to improve security on the border. But of course, you do not hear House Republicans talking about any of this because it doesn't fit their narrative. The only dereliction of duty here is House Republicans wasting time on political games instead of focusing on the real problems that we need to tackle to protect the homeland. Let's look again at the record. House Republicans introduced a measure to impeach Secretary Mayorkas 2 years ago when he had only been in office for 6 months. Politics. A leader of this committee in a closed-door fundraiser months ago announced that Republicans were going to impeach the secretary and said, quote, get the popcorn, it's going to be fun.
The gentleman yield. That's not what I said. So I want to correct the record. I never used the word impeachment. And I'm tired of this continual narrative falsely quoting me. I won't allow it, Mr. Magaziner.
Listen,
Continue your testimony.
I'll continue. Listen, another member of this committee, Ms. Green, just a few days ago, told the press that she voted on the debt ceiling bill only in exchange for a, quote, beautiful dessert, which is impeachment. So this has always been about politics and political games, and the most important fact is this. Since the expiration of President Trump's Title 42 policy, illegal border crossings are down 70%, and even when you include CBP One app appointments, which are legal, they're still down more than 60% since the expiration of Title 42. So there are a lot of things that we could be doing. Instead, we're wasting our time on theater. Now, Mr. Wolf, during your time running the Department of Homeland Security, were you ever impeached?
No.
No. During your time working at DHS in the Trump administration, did you prevent all unlawful entries into the United States?
We worked every day to do that.
But did you prevent all unlawful entries, yes or no?
No.
Okay. Well, I'm confused because I read Mr. Higgins' articles of impeachment that he filed a few days ago, and in short, they say that Secretary Mayorkas should be impeached because he failed to maintain operational control at the border, defined as the prevention of all illegal entries into the United States. So I don't understand, why didn't we impeach the DHS director under the Trump administration or any prior administration if that's the standard that warrants impeachment? Political theater, that's why. That's all this is, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I recognize Mr. Bishop from North Carolina.
I thank the chairman, and I think this is interesting, and it begins to ferret out what really is the key issue that this Congress needs to focus on in regards to the matter that's being testified to. And I appreciate the witnesses who are here. You're professional and dispassionate. I think almost no one is brazen enough anymore to deny that there's a border crisis created by the Biden administration, Secretary Mayorkas. Border Chief Ortiz admitted such on the way out the door. FEMA announced yesterday the distribution of more than $290 million in congressional funding to communities receiving migrants. You don't deploy FEMA resources when there isn't a crisis. But the issue here, and I agree, it shouldn't be political theater. It's not about policy differences, can't be. The issue here is vindicating the rule of law and the constitutional role and lawmaking power of Congress. Many claim the Trump indictment is about the rule of law. The ranking member says appropriately policy differences are of a different dimension, and I agree with that. And the appropriate response for Congress is different in each case. I don't even think, with all respect to the chairman, that our focus can be exactly on dereliction in the full sense articulated, because dereliction is willful or negligent. And what we need to focus on here is whether this is not a case of negligence. If it were, the implications would be different. The remedy would be different. Incompetence in administering a federal agency is maladministration, and the recourse falls to the people alone. But intentional sabotage of the rule of law is something entirely different. It is an affront to the separation of powers, to the institutional authority of the Congress under the Constitution, and it invites another remedy, and that is impeachment. Secretary Wolf, the ranking member, attacked actions by the Trump administration, but your statement, really elegant, 10 pages, covers a lot of ground. I urge people to look at it carefully. You point out that you were attacked for by the ranking member. These were exercises of authority specifically granted to Congress. Take migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico. You cite 235B2C of the INA. In the case of an alien described in subparagraph A, that's somebody who would have right otherwise to asylum, claim of asylum, who is arriving on land from a foreign territory contiguous to the United States, the Attorney General may return that alien to that territory pending a proceeding under Section 1229A of this title. So that's exactly what you did. Whether somebody said you did it in the exact way or if you want to challenge how some, you were exercising an authority. Same thing with safe third country agreements under Section 208A2A, and I won't read all that. But here's what you point out, the violations of law, several of these found by federal district judges at this point in time, by the catch and release, ignores the mandate to detain or make them wait, an asylum applicant wait in Mexico. That's been judged by Judge Wetherill in Florida to be unlawful. The use of notices, what are they called, NTRs, Mr. Wolf?
Notices to report.
Notices to report. So you don't even have any formal commencement of removal proceedings, which a notice to appear would be, setting a date, even though you never get to them. They don't even do it. They just let them go with NTRs. The exercise of authority to adjudicate asylum by DHS officials, maybe Mr. Edlow, you may have pointed this out in your testimony instead of in the Department of Justice where that power is reserved. An interior non-enforcement policy, Mr. Wolf, you pointed out the 100-day deportation freeze. Judge Tipton said that was illegal. Subsequent enforcement priorities established that exempt 99% from the threat of deportation. Secretary Mayorkas declaring that illegal presence alone is not grounds for removal. More than 1 million in the country subject to final removal orders, and they've said they're not going to remove them. So I'm just going to leave my last minute to you, Mr. Wolf, but I see what we're talking about is intentional sabotage of the rule of law as set by Congress, and that's a different ballgame.
It is different. It's not just about whether or not illegal aliens can claim asylum, as was talked about here earlier. As you indicated, at least in my written testimony, there's 7 different instances where I believe the law is not being faithfully executed, to include the categorical parole, which was the last one there.
And I didn't get to that.
Which is at ports of entry, which is at the heart of all of this. You know, to have asylum needs to be an urgent humanitarian benefit or advantageous somehow to the United States. Simply paroling up to 360,000 individuals, which is what they are on track to do per year, violates the letter of the law. It's very clear.
Final point here is that it does fall to Congress, as well as these judges, fall to Congress through the impeachment power to decide whether the law has been intentionally flouted. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Swalwell from California.
I've heard the phrase rule of law and accusations that the Biden administration is sabotaging the rule of law. And the title of this hearing is Secretary Mayorkas' dereliction of duty on the border crisis. But I think in contrast to that, it's very interesting to me that the chief witness that the majority has called here, Mr. Wolf, was found on November 14, 2020 by a federal judge to, quote, not lawfully be serving as acting secretary. Not lawfully serving as acting secretary. So a lot of considerations and concerns from my colleague across the aisle about the rule of law, but the witness that they called served unlawfully is the acting secretary of Homeland Security, where an accusation of dereliction of duty is being made today. In addition to that, again, it's interesting that this is the chief witness that they've called today, because on September 17, 2020, the unlawfully serving acting secretary, Mr. Wolf, failed to honor his congressional subpoena. Didn't show up, skipped the hearing. So you have someone who's acting unlawfully and somebody who skips a congressional subpoena, and we're going to be lectured by the majority about a dereliction of duty of the current lawfully serving, Senate-confirmed Secretary of Homeland Security. I think that's interesting and an important perspective that we should have as we consider what's going on at our southern border. Ms. Acer, I want to speak with you just about what is going on at the southern border. And if you were to think about the migrants who are fleeing the Northern Triangle, who leave everything they know, their family, their livelihood, their culture, their homes, their community, their churches, and take the journey to America, do you believe that if we were to find a way as a global alliance, public-private partnerships, to help invest in those countries in their economic security and their physical security, and stand up and support a rule of law and go after corruption, that would reduce the number of people who came to the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason that people are coming here to seek protection is because they're not being protected at home by their countries. There's a lot more that the United States can do to increase respect for human rights and to otherwise assist in making sure that conditions allow people who can stay safely in their home countries to do so.
And I understand, the counter to that will be, well, why would we invest money there if we have needs here? And there's no doubt we have needs here. But if we're going to be spending the money anyway, either enforcement of the border or taking care of people who come here, to me it just seems like a better holistic investment to try and work private sector, public sector, nonprofit, NGOs in those countries to stand up, as I said, economic and physical security. Also wanted to ask, what effect do you think it has, Ms. Acer, when my colleagues across the aisle and Republicans say that we have open borders? And in fact, the title of the hearing today is Open Borders, Closed Case. Do you think if you are south of our border and you're looking for somewhere to go to keep your family safe and to find some livelihood, if you hear people falsely declaring that the border's open, do you think that makes you more or less likely to try and go to the United States because you think the border's open?
I don't know how much migrants actually listen to, to these hearings, but you're right in that I've heard Mexican officials say they wished that US politicians would actually stop saying that the border was open because they thought that was really sending the wrong message. And sometimes disinformation, inaccurate information does get into Facebook groups that many migrants do follow.
Thank you, Ms. Acer. And I think the lesson here is that this issue is complicated. It involves human beings who are leaving everything. We've got our own struggles in the United States and clearly, cannot take on, a consistent flow from the southern border. But it needs solutions, not theater. And I'm afraid that my colleagues are interested in the crisis, but they're not interested in the solutions. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Jimenez from Florida for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Acer, you were quoted in the Baptist News Global referring to the end of Title 42, and you said that the dangers facing asylum seekers are more acute than they were years ago when the Trump administration started these policies, and these policies have contributed to a worsening of the conditions that face migrants and people seeking asylum. Did you make that statement?
I don't remember my exact words, but I probably did.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wolf, I believe, like my colleagues, that I don't believe that Mr. Mayorkas is incompetent. I think that he is derelict in his duty because I think everything that he's done is actually done on purpose. Do you share that view?
I do. This is by design.
Right. And so when, I've been an administrator, and when I've made mistakes and I listen to my folks and say, hey, why didn't that go the way that I wanted it to, I would listen and say and kind of change things. But Mr. Mayorkas kind of doubles down. And so when, in the first days of the Biden administration, a bunch of policies that the Trump administration had put in place in order to secure the border were overturned, and then things started to go south in a really big way. Do you know firsthand if people in the border, that Customs Border Patrol agents actually advised Mr. Mayorkas that, hey, you need to reverse these policies to stop this, this tidal wave that's coming into the United States?
Again, I wasn't there. It's my understanding that they did. Chief Scott was there in the Border Patrol advising the Biden administration, so I'm sure he can answer.
Well, Mr. Scott, can you answer that question?
Yeah, he was informed verbally, he was informed in writing. I think it's important for everybody to understand everything fundamentally changed. When I worked for Secretary Wolf, we had team meetings. We were asked for our input. We were told over your career what works and what doesn't work. On January 20th, 2021, that all got shut off. DHS, the Secretary even went to the step of shutting down the integrated teams of career professionals that were brought into DHS ops to provide guidance. Our input was no longer solicited, and when my team and I gave it unsolicited, we were basically put in a box. They did not want to know what we had to say. They made it very clear, expedite processing and find new ways to let migrants into the U.S. That was the only agenda.
Exactly, which is on purpose, really circumventing U.S. law.
100% on purpose, scripted out, and the Secretary is not incompetent.
No, I know he's not incompetent. He's derelict, without a doubt. Mr. Wolf, back to you. When you had the Remain in Mexico policy, and people were told to remain in Mexico, and then they had their asylum hearings, what percentage of those that were seeking asylum were actually granted asylum?
Again, it would have been under that about 10 to 15%. The number that grant asylum has been holding for years now. About 80 to 85% do not qualify, and about 10 to 15% do qualify, and we saw that again under MPP as well.
All right, so those are the people that actually qualify to get into the United States, are granted, paroled into the United States, given some kind of legal status in the United States because they actually have a valid asylum claim. Now, when you get rid of that, and then you allow them to come into the United States, and then you don't, well, the law also says that if you're seeking your asylum, you're supposed to be detained until your hearing, correct?
Correct.
That's not happening right now, is it?
It is not.
Okay, so now you've got all the people who are coming into the United States, they're actually being granted, entry into the United States, so you're actually increasing the number of migrants entering the United States illegally, because they don't really have a valid asylum claim, by about 80%. Would you agree with that number?
That sounds about right.
Okay, and so we don't even know where they are. We don't know where some of them are being tracked, some of them are not being tracked. We don't know where 85,000 children are at this point. I consider that to be a dereliction of duty. Children 85,000, we don't know where they are? Did that ever happen under the Trump administration?
85,000? No, absolutely not. Again, you have an unaccompanied alien child crisis at the moment, 380,000. And so when if you happen to go to the baseball game tonight, that fills National Stadium almost 9 times. That's how many children that have come across that border that have no parent, have no guardian, that have been smuggled by these Mexican cartels at the behest, sometimes of their parents, because they know that if they get across that border, they will remain here in the United States. And it is a terrible journey. You are subjecting them to just horrific conditions, and it needs to end.
And the Democrats dare to call what happened during the Trump administration inhumane. My time is up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Goldman of New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our witnesses were asked whether what Secretary Mayorkas has done is intentional. Obviously, it's intentional. He's not doing things unintentionally. And he has testified before us, and he has acknowledged repeatedly that we are dealing with a very difficult situation at the border. I want to focus on, go back to what my colleague, Mr. Swalwell, was focusing on, which is my friend, Mr. Bishop's quote that there is an intentional sabotage of the rule of law. Now, we've heard a couple times today that the GAO and a federal court found that Mr. Wolf was acting unlawfully. To my understanding, that would be a violation of the rule of law. But let's focus a little bit on some policies and some efforts. Mr. Jimenez mentioned that there are children who cannot be found, which brings up, of course, the Trump administration family separation policy. Mr. Wolf, when you were the chief of staff to the Secretary of Homeland Security, isn't it true that you supported the family separation policy?
I was at the department from 2017 to the end of the administration.
Well, did you not, according to an Inspector General's report, urge the counselor to the Attorney General to implement the family separation policy, to increase prosecution of family unit parents and separate family units?
No, I don't believe. No. That's
Okay, well, I want to introduce into the record this Inspector General's report on family separation, which includes an email by you to Gene Hamilton, the counselor to the Attorney General.
So that email had a number of options
hold on.
for consideration. There was no direction. There was no direct.
So you're saying right here, right now, that you did not support the family separation policy.
That was not
Is
your
that your
question.
testimony?
That was not your question.
I'm asking it right now. Is that your testimony?
We implemented a number of policies in the administration. I agreed with President Trump when he ended zero tolerance in June, I believe, of 2018.
Did you support the family separation policy?
Again, we had no family separation policy at the department.
Really? The department did not?
No, I'm happy to go through this.
All right,
the Attorney General
let's talk
announced
about
a zero tolerance policy that the department then implemented.
One sec. Let's talk about this, because the facts are that more than 5,000 children were forcibly separated from their parents at the border. And the reason is because the Department of Justice, for the first time, used Title 8, United States Code, Section 1325, which makes it a misdemeanor offense to charge anyone crossing without without papers, etc. That had never been used before, because the only point of that is to put parents who are charged with that in jail where they cannot actually be with their families. Now, a federal court in 2018 ended the family separation policy, which this court determined that there was, because the government's policy, quote, shocks the conscience, unquote, and violates the constitutional right to family integrity. There are still children who were separated at the border from their parents who have not been found because this zero tolerance policy, which ultimately ended up separating parents and children, did not create any mechanism to account for that separation in order to track the children. Now, that clearly, as a judge said, was a violation of the rule of law, an intentional sabotage of the rule of law. Let me go quickly to another one. According to a whistleblower complaint by the former head of the department's intelligence branch, Mr. Wolf ordered him to withhold an intelligence notification on Russian activities because it, quote, made the president look bad. The Office of Inspector General investigated it and found that the department did not adequately follow its internal processes and policy standards when editing and disseminating an intelligence product regarding Russian interference with the 2020 presidential election. And the acting secretary, Mr. Wolf, participated in that review process. Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up. I'd like to introduce for the record that Inspector General's report, which my staff will give. And I would like to note that before we start attacking this intentional sabotage of the rule of law, we ought to look in our own glass house. And I yield.
Without objection, so ordered. I recognize Mr. Pfluger from Texas for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How rich was that? Mr. Wolf, how many apprehensions occurred in the Trump years combined? I mean, just round numbers.
All 4 years?
Yeah.
I don't have a number for you. The chief may.
Chief?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, to be honest, but it was less than $1 million a year, and some years less than 500,000.
Okay. How many since Biden has taken over?
You have to define whether they're arrests or encounters,
Apprehensions,
but apprehensions would technically include encounters. There were over 6 million.
Okay. Known gotaways?
Known
that's been
gotaways
reported?
over 1.5 million, plus or minus. That's only the known.
Okay. Known or suspected terrorists?
There's been about 200. I think there's 98 this year. And
Okay.
again, those are just the ones that are known.
200 since January 2021. And Mr. Wolf, you guys reported known or suspected terrorists. Actually, it took us 6 months to get Mayorkas and the president to actually report known or suspected terrorists. What's the combined approximate total in the Trump years of known or suspected?
I believe it was 11.
11. How rich is that discussion that we just heard about looking in a glass house? You know what the political theater here is? Over 5 million apprehensions at our southern border, over 200 known or suspected terrorists, over 1.5 million known gotaways. I have constituents who are currently sitting in this committee hearing right now that live in West Texas. And these folks are dealing with the unfunded mandate that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are calling political theater? You're saying that 53 people that died in a tractor trailer south of San Antonio last summer is political theater? Give me a break. This is insane that we continue to look at this administration anything less than a complete abysmal failure. Mr. Wolf, it looks like you might have a reply or something that was from the previous question.
Well, I would just say that the previous question from the congressman was probably false on all fronts. I think it's a naive view of the situation that occurred in 2018. Children are separated from adults who may or may not be their parents. Perhaps they're their parents that are abusing them. This happens every day along the border. You need to visit the border. You need to talk to Border Patrol to actually understand the border. This happens every day in the Biden administration. This happens in the Trump administration, Obama, and it goes on and on and on. I'm sure the chief can tell you more about that. But this idea that it only started in 3 weeks in 2018, it's a false narrative.
Well, isn't it true that the Obama administration actually started family separation in all practicality? Mr. Scott, you served for 4 different presidents, both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, correct. I'm really offended by not by you, but the statement family separation. DHS, United States Border Patrol, under various different administrations, prosecute people for committing crimes. And we prosecute more people for committing crimes of the percentage of the total population as the numbers go down. Over years, we found out consequences slow down the flow of illegal immigration. A consequence is a prosecution. That's what we were doing in the field. That happened way before the Trump administration. Some of you may be familiar with Operation Streamline. The Border Patrol reported on it all the time. and that was misdemeanor prosecution of illegal entry, and it has a direct result in improved border security. The track record's there, multiple administrations.
Mr. Scott, when did you serve the Biden administration? What months or years?
For the Biden administration, from the day of inauguration until August 14th, 2021,
Okay, so for approximately 8 months.
plus or minus.
Was Secretary Mayorkas briefed on policy failures? Were there recommendations that were made to Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden from Border Patrol, from ICE, from Customs, from any of our DHS leaders?
I personally participated in numerous conference calls. The secretary insulated himself a lot, but he had representatives on those calls, and occasionally he was in those calls himself. And yes, it was very clear. But the administration made it very clear deterrence was no longer our mission, and we weren't even allowed to talk about it. The minute you talked about trying to slow down the flow or putting any kind of a deterrent mechanism in place, we were immediately stymied.
So this is a willful and complicit decision to turn away from the policies from 2017 to 2020 and go a different direction, which have resulted in the numbers that I previously said. And they've been advised, and there have been recommendations made by yourself and others that they have completely ignored.
Absolutely, and they're just carrying out their game plan that they said in the campaign.
This is complete dereliction of duty. I thank you, gentlemen, for your service to this country, Mr. Chairman. The dereliction that we see from Secretary Mayorkas is unprecedented, and it has resulted in so many assaults, deaths, and drugs and chaos in this country. Thank you for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Ivey from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I wanted to say that I was, when I arrived on the Hill this morning, I was surprised to find out that the committee had issued a report. It's styled Causes, Costs, and Consequences, and it's styled as Committee on Homeland Security Majority Report. And it's, I don't know, around 55 pages long. And what this document lays out is the Republican views with, I haven't had a chance to read it yet because, you know, I just got it. Actually was waiting in my spot here when I sat down to begin the hearing. So that's the first I saw it. And didn't have a chance to go through it. But I want to say a couple things about it. I look forward to reading it and having a chance to digest it. I'm deeply disappointed that a majority report didn't give the minority any opportunity not only to review it, but to respond to it. And I guess this isn't a formal report, but to the extent we're actually looking to try and do things together, to work together, to move the committee forward together, to address the issues that are being addressed not only in this hearing, but in previous hearings. This kind of approach doesn't work. In fact, it's counterproductive to say the least. And I understand you guys have a view, and some of the points you have are different than ours, some of ours are different than yours. But if we're going to try and address this together, we actually have to work together. And it has to begin before the hearing starts. What was especially disappointing about this one was I had a conversation with, I won't call a name, but a member of the report, the Republican side, on the House floor last night with respect to trying to move legislation in this committee. Part of it came out of the markup that we had a few weeks ago, where there was recognition, I thought, by both sides that the Democrats had offered some amendments that might make sense. For example, with respect to the drones issue, we were told when we went to visit the border that there was a 17-to-1 deficit. We'd offered an amendment to try and increase the number of drones and funding for it. The Republicans didn't take any amendments during the markup, and that's their prerogative. But there was a statement made at the time, well, maybe we can move amendments that you've offered that we find mutually acceptable, that are beneficial. Another one, for example, was additional funding for Border Patrol agents. And there's some provisions in the bill that passed, but not all, that we talked about to provide additional funding, hire more agents, retention by paying them more, and the like, since we're losing agents and it's harder to enforce the border with fewer agents than more agents. So we talked about actual legislation to try and address the problems that we're talking about here. And I was assured, hey, yeah, we can work together on this stuff. We got an oversight thing we got to do tomorrow, but, you know, we can work together on getting legislation done to it. I had no idea that the oversight thing, I knew the witnesses were coming. We got the testimony just barely 48 hours in advance, but at least we did get it in advance. But this report is you know, a blindside. And I think it's, hopefully that's not an indication of things to come. But I also did remember at a previous hearing, I raised this issue, it was the New York Times article that came out April 18th. Key Republican tells donors he will pursue impeachment of Mayorkas. Now, I don't need to go through it again. We put it in the record previously. But basically, it laid out a plan, a 5-phase plan, quote unquote, to set up the impeachment of Mr. Mayorkas. And I was told that these were misquotes and the like. You know, we're really going to try and work together on this. We're going to file the blah, blah, blah. In the hearing, this is on the record. And then I get this. You know, I understand that both sides differ. As I mentioned before, you know, my first job here was 1987 on Capitol Hill working for Congressman Conyers. And I'm sorry I missed earlier parts of the meeting because I had votes in judiciary, but can we actually try and address some of these problems by working together? I know we've got different sides. I understand how hearings work. You guys get 3 witnesses, we get 1. That's fine. But let's try and do things that we can disagree without being disagreeable and try and move our points forward, I think. Because this is the Homeland Security Committee. Our goal, I think, for all of us is to try and do what's best to help the American people. And it's harder to do it when we're working at cross purposes. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Edlow, what is the legal basis for asylum?
The INA, Section 208, sets out exactly what asylum is.
Is general economic hardship a legal basis for asylum?
Oh, a legal basis? No, it is not. There are 5 recognized grounds of asylum.
Is general violence or crime alone is general violence or crime alone a legal basis for asylum?
It is not, Congressman.
Is political instability alone a legal basis for asylum?
Not alone, no.
Does filing an asylum claim after entering illegally or improperly negate the fact that the individual entered illegally to begin with?
No, it doesn't. However, when someone comes in at the port of entry, claims credible fear, has a positive credible fear determination, at that point they are given the opportunity to present an asylum claim. Under Section 235, they are supposed to be detained. As we know, that's not been happening, but they are able to stay in the country to file that claim. It is not, they do not have legal status in the country. They are an asylum applicant at that point.
Thank you. Are you aware that the CBP and Troy Miller, CBP acting commissioner, have recently tweeted that most of those claiming asylum at the border don't qualify for asylum as economic migrants?
I'm not aware of the tweet, but I would agree with it.
Yeah, that's great. Prior to the Biden administration, how were the words urgent humanitarian reasons and significant public benefit in a parole statute interpreted by DHS?
So I don't think there's necessarily been a change in the actual interpretation of the wording, but where I think there's a change is the sheer volume of categorical parole programs that we've seen. I'm not going to sit here and say that there were not some categorical parole programs under the Trump administration. I, for the most part, would have liked to have seen them go away. I don't think that they're lawful, with the exception of maybe the Cuba Accords that allowed for the Cuban family reunification. The remainder of the programs probably should not have been there. However, we saw maybe 20, 30,000 people over the course of the 4 years get paroled in under these types of programs, whereas now we're seeing mass parole where in the months prior to them stopping parole, given the court decisions and some other things, we saw months where there was over 100,000 people paroled in that month. So the sheer volume of parole numbers is astronomical now. Plus they're doing it for specific countries, whole populations of those countries. If they have a sponsor here, that's not case by case, that I don't see if they have humanitarian needs to get here, they can come through other means. They can come to the border and ask for credible fear, as what we expected before. This is not an appropriate use of the parole authorities.
Thank you very much. I know a lot of numbers going. You talk about paroles are going up. We've seen numbers in migrants found dead on U.S. soil also go up. Mr. Scott, CBP personnel have reported informally that more than 1,700 migrants have been found dead on U.S. soil during this administration's watch, Biden and Mayorkas' watch. More than 500 were found dead in fiscal year 2021, and reportedly more than 800 were found dead in fiscal year 2022. The 5 years prior to fiscal year 21, the number had not exceeded 300 in any given year. Why is the number of dead migrants found on our soil increasing so much?
Because chaos kills people, and we've created a chaotic border situation. Additionally, Border Patrol has a search and rescue team that would normally just respond and be out in remote desert areas looking for people in advance. And they're processing civil immigration cases, so we're leaving vast sections of border open. And I would argue those numbers are probably underreported. I was down at the border recently talking to some local sheriffs, and they're telling me that they're finding bodies on ranches. There are people dead along the border they believe have just crossed that are not included in CBP's numbers. But chaos kills people, and that's what we've created on our border.
I appreciate that. And I have 50 seconds left. I know people run out of time when they want to answer questions, so I want to yield the rest of my time to Mr. Wolf. If there's anything you want to continue to say about this hearing and what you've experienced, I'd appreciate it.
No, again, I think what we did during the Trump administration is every day, we weren't perfect, but every day we worked to install policies and operations that further secured that border, that actually upheld the rule of law day after day after day. Some we got right, some we got wrong at the end of the day. I think if you look at the overall evidence of the past 27 months, that is not the case. They have specifically torn down policies and put others in place that make that border significantly less secure, not only from a humanitarian perspective, but also from a national security and a public safety perspective as well.
Thank you very much. I ran out of time, so I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Clark. All right, Mr. Garcia, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today as well. I want to just a couple notes. I think that first, I just want to note that there's been a lot of attacks, of course, on the Biden administration and the work that's happening on the border. I think that obviously, as a reminder, that Democrats also want a safe and secure border that's in the interest of everyone in our country. And I also want to note that there's been a bemoaning that, of course, that since the end of Title 42, that the chaos at the border that oftentimes many in this committee were rooting for just also did not happen. And so once again, it's very clear that we're getting another political hearing, another distraction from the real issues that are in front of our country. I also want to note that there's been, once again, a repeating of things that have been debunked by witnesses, by experts, repeated over and over in this committee. We've been ignoring the facts about fentanyl. We want to blame the opioid epidemic on people that are seeking their legal right to asylum and not actually on the failures of our treatment system in the United States. Folks want to feed a narrative that if we just invade Mexico, things will get better in this country, and all these things, along with false claims that our border is somehow open. The men and women of our Department of DHS and our partnerships with NGOs and in Mexico are doing their jobs. And again, the border is not open, and we continue to do that work in this country. I also want to just remind members of this committee, there's been a lot of back and forth on the issues around family separation, and I want to give Ms. Acer a chance to respond to this. We've heard a lot about family separation under the Trump administration, and specifically, quite frankly, a rewriting of what actually happened and of history. Can you clarify the actual differences between what happened in the Trump administration to what's happening today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trump administration initiated policies that they knew would separate children from their parents. The decision to start prosecuting families for initial entries was done with full knowledge of what the impact would be. I actually met mothers in detention centers who had been separated from their children, had no idea where they were or how to find them. It was heartbreaking as a parent.
And I want to note that I think that the differences between what's happened during the Trump administration, what's happening today, and the point of actually the whole process is completely different. And so I want to thank you for that clarification. And one other question. In this committee, we've had members of the majority work to defund programs with NGOs, particularly around with Catholic charities who's trying to support legal asylum, which is really shameful and really counterproductive to our work and our humanitarian work along the border. Can you explain why our partnerships with NGOs that are providing these services are so important to the work that DHS does and across the border?
Yeah, absolutely. Those partnerships are critical globally around the world, as well as here at home. Faith leaders, faith volunteers, employees of faith organizations and other NGOs, are inspiring. Those who are motivated by their religions are trying to welcome the stranger day in and day out through their work. Refugees around the world are welcomed by faith-based and other organizations. That's critical to enable all the other countries to be hosting refugees. But here at home, we need more support for the organizations that are working to welcome refugees into our communities. There's also a disgraceful lack of support for the organizations in Mexico that are struggling to host refugees who are now waiting to seek asylum at our ports of entry.
Thank you. And finally, I just want to note, I know there's been discussion about the One App application, and I think one of the key reasons that conditions have improved and really we're focused on legal pathways is because the CB One App, the CBP One App, after we all agree a difficult rollout has actually made things a lot better. And so I just want to thank everyone that worked on that, the department, so many groups that have been involved in the rollout, and now over 1,000 migrants a day are able to use that app to exercise their legal right to asylum, which I think is really important. It is a legal right, even though some in the majority choose to not see it that way. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Ms. Green of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting to me to listen to some Democrats here on the committee trying to harp on the very idea that Mr. Wolf is somehow illegitimate as the former acting secretary. We Republicans here, we are committed to searching for answers as to why this administration continues to inflict catastrophic damage to our country. And here, I just want to remind you of a few things that are very important to understand. Not only is fentanyl poisoning the #1 cause of death of young Americans ages 18 to 49, nearly 83,000 Americans have died of opioid poisonings since the year 2022, and they die weekly in my district. 96 individuals on the terrorist watch list have been apprehended. Crime has skyrocketed across the country. And we're missing 85,000 children, 85,000 children. And while Democrats across the aisle on this committee want to talk about families being separated under the Trump administration, I'd like to introduce for the record, Mr. Chairman, a letter from Custom and Border Protection saying that the Biden administration is ending DNA testing, familial DNA testing, as of, that was at the end of May 31st, 2023. So when you talk about separating children, we have the Biden administration not even testing who these adults and these children are. And I can't comprehend it. Everyone in this room knows what an Amber Alert is. We all get them on our phones, right? This is when a child has been kidnapped. And we are so concerned in this country about children who have been kidnapped that we have something called an Amber Alert, notifying all of us that there is a missing child. 85,000 children missing, migrant children missing in the United States is the same thing as 85,000 Amber Alerts. It's unbelievable. Mr. Wolf, many of the children are brought to the United States by coyotes and human smugglers. In your view, how is Secretary Mayorkas responsible for exacerbating the unaccompanied children humanitarian crisis?
Well, it's not just one action. It's obviously a culmination of a variety of different incentives. It's an incentive structure that has been created over the past 27 months that allows individuals to come into the country and remain into the country. When you exempt UACs from Title 42, that sends a signal to the cartels and to everyone else to smuggle as many children across that border as humanly possible. We know they're going to stay in the United States. So when you make these categorical pronouncements, the cartels are watching and they are paying attention. And just to key off on your last point, not only did DNA testing about to end, the vetting of sponsors also ended at HHS under this administration. No more vetting, detailed, in-depth vetting of sponsors. We also increased vetting of other household members. We didn't just want to know who the sponsor was. We wanted to know other household members and dive into those backgrounds. That was eliminated as well. Site visits, not every home was visited, but random site visits to make sure that those children were where they said they would be, also eliminated under this administration. So the idea that somehow they're protecting children because they needed to facilitate the flow out of HHS facilities quicker and quicker is a misnomer.
Unbelievable. Mr. Scott, it has been reported that many minors at the southwest border are in fact related to adults with whom they are traveling. In fact, some of them are even recycled. I can't even comprehend using the term recycled when it comes to children. And these kids are used again by different cartels and human smugglers to guarantee admission of family units. In your estimation, has this exploitation of minors exponentially expanded under the Mayorkas' policies?
I believe it has, and this is why. Every one of those child recycling cases, and if you don't understand what that means a child being teamed up with a fake family over and over again, so he has to make that trip over and over again because that gets them to become a family unit and they get into that categorical exemption to get released. Every one of those cases was discovered by an agent interviewing the child and finding little cracks in the story. That takes time. The agents don't have that time today. Those conversations are no longer going on at all. They're being pumped through the system like fast food commodities. Worse than that, now the DNA piece of it is being shut down as well. That was one of the last tools to be able to quickly be able to prove somebody was not related. That doesn't mean that there's not some kind of a connection there, but that gave the agents a tool. Most people broke immediately when they believed they were going to be subjected to the DNA. You didn't even have to do it. This administration knows they're putting children at risk every day. They're enticing them to come to the country, and it defies common sense.
Thank you. He should be impeached.
Gentlelady yields. The chair recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and let me thank the distinguished ranking member and chairman and my colleagues and members and the witnesses. Every time you put yourself forward, we certainly thank you very much. But this is a journey that I've taken now for 28 years, maybe a little shorter, and it never fails that whenever a Republican administration is in, my Republican friends are in the majority, there is an enormous crisis, and the executive does nothing. There is no effort to write legislation. There's no effort to correct what any one of you are saying. And it is, with all due respect and admiration and friendship, it's a broken record. It is literally a broken record. Before the late John McCain passed, there was a gang of 8 who had an enormous contribution to trying to do an overhaul over immigration reform. And it was the party that is now in charge of the House that blocked it. I worked with, on this committee, a chairwoman by the name of Candace Miller from Michigan. We worked on comprehensive immigration reform measures to address the U.S.-Mexico border, which was blocked by the Republican leadership at that time. Do your homework. In years past, we've written legislation to provide the border personnel every manner of support we could give them. So let me be very clear. The Remain in Mexico program was horrible because I went and visited the squatter that the people were sitting in. There was nowhere for them to go. It was misery. Nothing was happening. The border wall, you can get a nice comment and quote, our men and women at the border are very nice people. They will give you quotes. But it is well known that most of fentanyl comes through the United States citizens through legal ports of entry. And it is also well known that even though you'll say, well, that's because we need more border wall, that the border communities fight you for the border wall, not to have it. And smugglers and others find other ways. As relates to the asylum cooperative agreements, we have agreements now with Venezuela, Haiti, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and as relates to Title 42, the Republicans voted to end the public health provision that the president ended, and by its very essence, you ended Title 42. Let me quickly, because I will be going to one witness, because all the other witnesses, I know what you're going to say, but I do appreciate the work that Ms. Acer is doing, so please be ready for a question. I'm trying to get through. I heard the word impeachment. I don't know whether it was going in the direction of my president, the President of the United States, or whether it was going in terms of Secretary Mayorkas, an immigrant himself, who pulled himself up by the bootstraps and has more commitment in his tiny finger than what I would imagine some who advocate against him. And I make that generic. But Secretary Mayorkas has done nothing contrary to his boss. He is a member of the cabinet, and his boss wants America to be safe, the President of the United States. And every aspect of work that we can do, from the increased resources, from adding to the additional personnel, to creating pathways for people to parole in, for creating the app, and the numbers have gone down. They surge up, they go down, it depends upon movements of people. And so you have no more answers than anyone else. Mr. Wolf, you were in there for a year or 2 years, and I don't see anything that you did that has brought down anything that we're talking about. And this is not a personal statement, because I want to add and say, I appreciate your service to the nation. But everybody that's sitting there that's criticizing had their opportunity. We've got to come together as a country and stop scaring our constituents, because America is getting more diverse, and they are contributing to the economy and to the culture of this nation. The world watches as to whether or not we can make this experiment work. They're in awe of us. And they come because they're in awe, because they're desperate, because they think this is the greatest country in the world, and it is. And its democracy, however challenged, is still standing. It bothers me to masquerade. I have this question, Mr. Chairman, asked her indulgence so she can answer it. I represent Catholic Charities and many others. I fought to get hostages back from Russia. I have dealt with the crisis of deportation, families separated. What does it do to our very dedicated nonprofits who are innocent, who have the responsibility of taking care of people in streets, people who are separated, children who are separated, people who are traveling, that you would assess them criminally or fine them so that they're so scared that they cannot do the normal humane things for individuals who even may be in here on a legal pathway coming into the United States? Mr. Chairman, I ask your indulgence for her to be able to ask that question.
Just if you could make your answer short, Ms. Jackson-Lee's already over her time, so I'll allow it. I'll allow it, and just make your answer as quick as possible.
No basis for the Secretary to be impeached, but go right ahead.
It's reprehensible. Not only does it punish people for acting on their humanitarian values, it also punishes them for acting on their faith beliefs as well. And it's totally counterproductive. I mean, here in America, we need our faith-based organizations, we need our communities to step up and be part of the solution. And many Americans want to do that and are doing that as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Lalota for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, sir, for your leadership in bringing this committee together on this hearing, and for your efforts to make my constituents' lives safer for securing the southwest border. I appreciate the witnesses and your expertise being here. I represent the 1st Congressional District of New York. The western edge of my district is about an hour or so east of New York City. And over the past several weeks, my constituents have heard how New York City's sanctuary city policies, coupled, of course, with our country's non-secure and wide-open southwest border, have overwhelmed New York City's resources, previously meant for the homeless, for folks suffering from substance abuse and veterans in need. And given the influx of migrants who are attracted to New York City because of those sanctuary city policies, the city can no longer handle the influx of those migrants. And in response, New York City Mayor Adams is now attempting to sending those same migrants who are attracted by those sanctuary city policies to suburban counties throughout the state who have expressly rejected those sanctuary city policies. And Mr. Wolf, that leads me to my first question, sir. Can you please explain what sort of costs, such as monetary, personnel, public safety, are imposed on states, cities, and counties in dealing with the current crisis at the southwest border?
Sure, there's a variety of different costs. All of the children that we've talked about go into public education systems. English is usually not their first language, and so that's going to strain public education systems in every community that they go into, certainly the ones that they go to in a large amount. Health systems, public safety systems. You now have public safety officers, law enforcement officers having to deal with additional crimes and additional incidents, particularly along the border, that I've talked to sheriffs that are overwhelmed because of what's going on. And then we talk about the money that DHS is sending to NGOs, right? Billions of dollars, I'd say millions of dollars being sent to NGOs for a crisis that they created that they're now using taxpayer dollars to send to try to solve the crisis. And so there's a lot of different costs, that American taxpayers bear.
What, if anything, sir, can you say about the cost on public safety with a whole slew of unvetted adult migrants that are being shipped to suburban counties? What can you say as far as what public safety costs?
I think there's a variety of different, ways. If you talk to law enforcement officers along the border, they're dealing with crimes and they're dealing with incidents that they've never had to deal with before. When you talk of military-aged males, individuals coming over that are a certain age that are not being vetted, right? We talk about 1.5 million gotaways. These are individuals that obviously don't want to interact with law enforcement officers for a very specific reason. They're here to do bad things. Or we talk about 100,000 Afghans that weren't properly vetted. And we've seen, and there's been reports of crimes and incidents that are occurring on that front. So I think there's a variety of different things that you can point to that says if the process was followed correctly and individuals were vetted as they should be, some of this should not have occurred.
$4 billion. New York City has said that it will spend $4 billion next year caring for and housing the illegal alien population that has come to New York City because of its sanctuary city policies. $8 billion. Texas on track to spend more than $8 billion on Operation Lone Star, doing the job that Secretary Mayorkas won't do, securing the southwest border. And another question for you, Mr. Wolf. How do these massive expenditures affect the cities and states who are forced to pay them? And is it fair for New York and Texas law-abiding taxpayers to have to suffer the burden that the open border and the sanctuary city policy?
No, none of this is fair. None of this should be occurring, but this is what happens when the federal government refuses to do its job. We've never seen this before. As I testified, it's in my oral and written, every administration has progressively tried to make improvements along that border. I would argue that some administrations did more than others, but every administration, at least in my lifetime, has done that. This is the first that has not only taken 1 or 2 steps back, we've probably taken 5 to 10 steps backwards. And so that's got to be picked up by someone. And it's different states along the border, and it's different municipalities, cities, and officials that have to pick up the slack. They have to protect their communities.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here today with your expertise and your experience. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to correct the record of my colleague, Mr. Lalota. These immigrants had no choice in where they ended up in this nation. They crossed the southern border, yes, but it was governors of the states of Texas and Florida that put these individuals on buses directed to New York City. So having said that, we are currently, as my colleague, Rep. Correa, demonstrated in his line of questioning, witnessing an unprecedented human migration movement around the world of individuals seeking refuge, safety, and economic opportunity. Individuals are fleeing economic instability, governmental corruption and persecution, violence. Climate change has ravaged food and water supplies in their homes of origin. And this has been evident in many nations within the Western Hemisphere, and especially in the Caribbean, in the island nation of Haiti, as individuals have been enduring far more dangerous means and methods to escape and to seek refuge. here in the United States. This is not just a challenge for the United States, but a global challenge. And we must step up to the plate to do our part. So my first question, my only question, is to you, Ms. Acer. Would you agree that there's an unprecedented movement of vulnerable people in the Americas and worldwide? And can you speak about how that is affecting our border and how our government should work with regional partners to address this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a significant increase in people fleeing in search of protection in the Americas in recent years. There's also been a shift with increasing numbers fleeing from Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. I'm sure some of you know, for example, about the crackdown on political opposition and faith groups in Nicaragua, forcing many people to flee that country, for example. People who have fled from Venezuela are facing restrictions in some of the countries that they have been in, and they are seeking safety and stability as well. So there's been major regional shifts, but there's a lot that we can be doing and doing more of in the region. Incredibly important is to continue to support as best we can the frontline countries that are actually hosting the vast majority of refugees. I mentioned, for example, that countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are hosting 6 out of the 7 million Venezuelans who left their country. It's certainly in the U.S. interest to continue to support those efforts. Critically important that we now have a commitment to start long overdue resettlement from the region, from the Americas. That needs to be absolutely stepped up. And you mentioned the plight of Haitians, who are facing such extreme dangers that the UN and the UN Refugee Agency said that it is too dangerous for people to be returned to Haiti right now. Parole, for example, has been an incredible lifeline for some people from Haiti, but the parole processes are not as accessible as they should be for many people facing dire risks, and the numbers are too small. There's really no way often for Haitians to actually flee in search of refuge. So thank you so much for everything that some of you have been doing. I would really encourage bipartisan support for the programs that are helping refugees around the world, for the expansion of refugee resettlement from the region, and for these very legal parole initiatives.
And I'd like to thank you for the work that you're doing. And Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to enter this report led by the Haitian Bridge Alliance with input from Ms. Acer and Human Rights First, which documents their observations on the southern border following the end of Title 22.
Without objection,
And
so
I'd
ordered.
also like to just say that for those who are Christians in the room, I just find it very, disorienting that we see suffering around us as a nation, one of the wealthiest in the hemisphere, and that today we sit here not looking for solutions, but creating problems. Jesus Christ was a refugee. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito of New York for his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel. Thank you for those who have served this country and for all the work that you can continue to do. I first want to start with, a simple question to each of you and ask who Secretary Mayorkas was appointed by.
The President.
Our current President.
President Biden.
Thank you. Mr. Scott?
President Biden.
President Biden.
President Biden.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make that clear. So I guess my first question is going to be to Mr. Scott. There was a story that in response to a mounted Border Patrol agent in Del Rio, Texas, Secretary Mayorkas had stated about the images that were shared, that they, quote, "Those images painfully conjured up the worst elements of our nation's ongoing battle against systemic racism." Now, I ask that question because on my multiple visits to the border and speaking to Customs and Border Patrol agents, just recently I visited JFK Airport, which is just blocks from my district. I'm a retired NYPD detective, and I feel that boots on the ground, having conversations, speaking cop to cop, you really get an understanding of how people feel. So how do Border Patrol agents who have legitimately made it their life's work to secure our border feel when their so-called leader, the Secretary of Homeland Security, rewards their hard work by slandering them as systemically racist?
It's a kick in the gut. And I'd like to point out that that followed the Secretary going on national TV and declaring that the border was secure. So his credibility was already challenged, but that second kick in the gut really damaged morale beyond anything that could be imagined.
Thank you. And I think what was important, you said in your opening statement, that this is not about policy. It's about his legal duty and the fact that he took an oath. And I said when he was here that you take an oath to defend and protect the Constitution, you protect our nation's borders, and that's what he should be doing. From the moment he wakes up in the morning to the moment he closes his eyes in his bed, he should be working every second to protect this great nation. I think it's clear from today's hearing that Secretary Mayorkas has been derelict in his duties to secure the homeland, but also derelict in his ability to protect CBP agents and DHS employees. Both Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz and National Border Patrol Council Vice President Chris Cabrera recently told Congress that 17 CBP personnel committed suicide in 2022, the highest total in over a decade. How has Mayorkas' unprecedented border crisis affected the lives and families of our Border Patrol agents?
I'm hesitant to blame the border crisis on any specific death or suicide, but I want people to think about this. Every law enforcement agency out there has to make decisions. He misses birthdays, he misses soccer games just because of the schedules they work. There's a lot of family tension. But historically, that officer's been able to go home and say, I'm protecting America. I'm doing this so that our kids can have a better life. This administration makes Border Patrol agents and many CBP officers feel like smugglers. They no longer have that intrinsic mission that they can justify to their spouse, to their kids, of why they miss those important events. I believe that has cascading effects in many areas and can potentially be a factor in this suicide.
And I agree with you, and I think that someone who came from law enforcement, there's nothing more important than knowing that your leader, or so-called leader, has your back. And when you go to work every day and realize that the control at the border is no longer in your control, but now in the control of cartels, it makes your life more difficult. 17 CBP suicides in 1 year is absolutely intolerable. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has been derelict in his handling of the crisis among the Border Patrol agents? And I don't just mean the policies along the border, but the way that he's treating the men and women who put on that uniform, the men and women who stand that line, the men and women who want to protect our points of entry.
I believe he's derelict, and I'll go back to the horse patrol incident in Del Rio. You know, everybody focuses on the first allegation that was proved wrong very, very quickly. Yet behind the scenes, Secretary Mayorkas still moved to take disciplinary action against those agents for doing nothing but trying to prevent the illegal entry of aliens into this country right in front of them, which is their job. When he disciplined those agents, that sent a resounding message throughout the entire workforce that not only did he not have your back, he was out for you.
I agree. Listen, when so-called leaders, and we've seen it in the state where I'm from, when you take the handcuffs from the police, when you take the handcuffs from their belt and actually handcuff the police and give criminals, and in this case, cartels, more resources, things need to change, and I appreciate your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Menendez for his questioning. Gentleman's from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you know, it's this, as I think others have alluded to, this is a bit of a frustrating day. We had Secretary Mayorkas here in front of this committee, and I think there was maybe only a handful of questions asked during that hearing from colleagues across the side. The opportunity to really engage with the secretary that you're now looking to remove from office. And there wasn't a lot of appetite to engage in that honest conversation. And then today we get this report shortly before this meeting, and it took me no time to go through it because this is supposed to be an investigation, a report, looking into what's happening at our border. But throughout it, using sources like Fox News, the Heritage Foundation, the Washington Examiner, the Center for Immigration Studies, an extreme think tank, the Daily Signal, all outlets that reaffirm what Republicans want to make the border seem. Instead of doing a real investigation, thoughtful about how we can improve the situation at the border, which Democrats have engaged in. When we've talked with Chief Ortiz, he's talked about how the funding is working, that they have the funding that they need, but they need to continue to work on recruitment. He even spoke about how morale is high, which you don't hear from folks in this room, because I feel like there's an attempt to paint a picture that is politically beneficial for folks, my colleagues, who I do have an immense amount of respect for. But they've already made the decision about what they want this report to be. And you look at the sources throughout, you look at how statistics are framed, and it's all done to get to the destination that they had already decided they want to arrive on. And to me, that's extremely problematic, along with other things throughout this. And again, we only had minutes to review, and I was just in a T&I committee on the FAA reauthorization, but there's a section called Empowering a Vast NGO Network to Facilitate Illegal Immigration. We're talking about groups like Catholic Charities. We're not talking about some sinister operation that the federal government is working with NGOs to move illegal aliens across. That's not what's happening. We're talking about people who are trying to help other human beings, organizations like the Catholic Charities. And here in this report, we're making it seem sinister. Also, just to be clear, this is not just about the border. There's a section, rolling back DACA. DACA, people who have lived here their entire lives. Rolling back DACA is one of the solutions that we should give consideration to. So this is not just about the border. This is about, an extreme policy towards the border, towards immigration, based on, non-objective sources that aided this report to move in a way where it got to the destination I think a lot of people wanted to get to. And that's disappointing. I do think people ask us and look to us to get to real solutions. The last thing I'll say is I think there has been an immense amount of talk about 85,000 unaccompanied minors who are lost. I don't believe any of the witnesses are with HHS or have worked at HHS, but as I understand it, the situation is that they place calls to these families, to these sponsors of these children, and there is 85,000 unanswered calls. I understand that as a fact, but there's no one here from HHS that can speak to that, but it's something that I think would course correct a lot of the conversation that's been had today. Obviously, if there's any migrant children that are unaccounted for, that's something we want to work on. That's absolutely something we want to work on. But when you talk about the dereliction duty, when you talk about all the things that you try to cast upon this administration, upon this particular secretary, you're doing so in a dishonest way. And that's just a disappointing thing for me because I do have so much respect for our public servants, my colleagues, the staff of this committee. But this is not the direction we should be heading. This is not the result. If you want to take a real look at the border, this is really, to me, just political messaging. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Lee from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this important hearing and to our witnesses for being here today. It is undeniable that we have a national security and a humanitarian crisis at our southern border. Under Secretary Mayorkas' leadership at the Department of Homeland Security, the number of illegal border crossings has reached a record high, and many of these crossings are unaccompanied children. These children are vulnerable to trafficking, exploitation, and other forms of abuse. Just last month, we saw a migrant child who arrived in Safety Harbor near my district without a parent or guardian who died in federal custody. Tragedies like these are avoidable and preventable. And today we've heard testimony about decisions that are being made at the Department of Homeland Security that have facilitated this crisis. Mr. Wolf, I'd like to return specifically to a line of earlier testimony you were providing about the decisions of Secretary Mayorkas to suspend certain policies that have had the net effect of endangering these unaccompanied children who are coming across our border. Specifically, you touched on a couple of things. The vetting of sponsors and household members for these children is not being done appropriately, and that site visits have been eliminated. Would you tell us, please, a little bit more about those safety protocols and the significance of them not being done effectively?
Sure. Once children come across that border and Border Patrol apprehends them, they are quickly transferred over to HHS facilities where they stay until they're able to find a sponsor, and the sponsor picks them up, and they do that. What we were finding was that individuals coming to pick them up, we didn't know who they were. And the background checks and the type of vetting that was done was not sufficient. We wanted to make sure that we were protecting those minors and that they were going into households that they wouldn't be trafficked, they wouldn't be further trafficked in. But again, this administration, for a variety of different reasons, I think we could only guess, decided to reduce the amount of vetting on those sponsors that come and pick them up. But it's not only the sponsor, it's the others in that household. So it's not enough to do that background check on one adult. But if there's 5 other adults in that household, you want to know who they are as well. Again, they have reduced those vetting requirements, site visits as well. And my guess, and it's a guess, is because early on in this administration, the number of children coming across that border in such astronomically high numbers was backing up HHS facilities. There were too many children in there, and so the quickest way to get children out of those facilities is to reduce the amount of time they're in the facility, which is to say, reduce the amount of vetting, because vetting does take time. We need to make sure that we know who those individuals are that are picking up these children. But if you reduce that amount of vetting and you reduce the time, then the children can go through those facilities quicker, and there's not lines and they're not backing up.
And Mr. Wolf, is it correct to say that those protocols, those measures that you used to implement with checking the people, checking the sponsors, checking the people who are living in that home, verifying that the sites are safe, and conducting that ongoing monitoring of the sites, was that an important part of ensuring that we're keeping these unaccompanied minors safe when they're here in our country?
Well, absolutely. From the HHS perspective, Chief Scott talked about it earlier, DNA testing is something that Border Patrol could do. So we actually tried to find it early in the system as humanly possible, which is when they cross that border and they go before that Border Patrol officer to do that questioning, that line of questioning. And again, as you reduce that, you're taking more and more protections away from trying to protect these children and trying to reduce the amount of trafficking that's going on.
Thank you. And on that subject, Mr. Scott, would you please return to the subject of DNA testing and tell us what role does DNA testing, why is it important in our efforts to combat human trafficking and the exploitation of children?
It's very important for the simple reason you're trying to identify people and you're trying to make sure people's stories actually match. I left out of my statement earlier, in the INA, it mandates that we fingerprint and photograph anybody over 14 years of age. It's silent below, but council has determined that you need reasonable, articulated facts above and beyond to do the fingerprinting and photographing of minors. So most children, because again, Border Patrol doesn't have time right now to get those facts, aren't fingerprinted or photographed. So there's no historic data to look at to figure out if the child is being recycled or not. Then on top of that, the massive flow. So the DNA testing, the real actual rapid testing at the stations, and just the threat of that could take a potential 2 or 3 hour interview and make it into minutes. Because people broke left and right that it's not really my kid, because we would tell them, you're gonna be prosecuted. You can tell me the truth now. But now they don't have the ability to do the threat, and then if someone sticks to their story, they don't have the ability to actually identify that there is no actual biological connection between these people. More children will be trafficked, more children are at risk.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize we have Ms. Titus here. I recognize Ms. Titus from Nevada.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. I was in a markup, but it doesn't sound like I missed much because it's the same old points being hammered over and over again for political reasons and not trying to really look for a solution. Also, this committee just continues to look at this one topic. If you're talking about dereliction of duty, perhaps we should be looking at some of the other aspects of Homeland Security, like cybersecurity. That's such a major issue, or real immigration reform, or domestic terrorism. Those are all part of our charge, and not looking at those, I think, is a dereliction of duty. In my district, we have a lot of mixed status families. We have somebody who is a dreamer, somebody who's TPS, somebody who's a citizen, somebody who has no papers, and somebody who doesn't even know what they are. So that's 5 problems all in one. I'd like to ask you, Ms. Acer, if you would comment a little bit about the TPS aspect of that, because it was just announced that the president was going to extend TPS for El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Nepal. Can you talk about how that helps with humane immigration or accommodation of people here? We've got 6,000 TPS holders, mostly from El Salvador in southern Nevada. So I'd just like to hear more about where that is.
Yeah, TPS is critical. It is, a life-saving protection for people from places that, are too dangerous or for other reasons people cannot be returned to. So it's a lifesaver. It could be improved, and there needs to be access for people to eventually, after a certain number of years, to really be able to stabilize their families, to be able to bring their kids to safety, and ultimately to get onto a path to citizenship.
Well, I know that the former president ended TPS, excuse me, for some of these countries. And for some people who had been here 20 years, had established a family, had a job, paying taxes, and then suddenly that's yanked away and they're sent back. So maybe you could help us with some ways that we could actually put forward to improve the system, as you mentioned.
I'd happy to suggest changes, and I think one of the most important ones is that people can actually get onto a path to citizenship at some point, and also to bring their families together. We also need to make sure to be using redesignation authority, because sometimes situation in a country triggers a need for TPS, and then time can change again. Time goes on, but actually the situation is even worse, so that TPS needs to be redesignated to make sure to protect people.
Well, thank you. Also, I think you were on the ground when Title 42 was lifted. There were some that were just so anxious to see these people rush across the border, chaos, sending down troops. I don't know if they thought there was going to be some confrontation, but of course it didn't happen, and the numbers have actually gone down. Would you talk about that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so we were there, including on the first day after Title 42. We were in Matamoros. We also were in Reynosa. Everywhere we went, we met asylum seekers. We spoke to, I think, hundreds of asylum seekers. I was part of a delegation with the Haitian Bridge Alliance and other NGOs, as well as just on our own with our own researcher. And people were struggling to follow the process for seeking asylum at ports of entry. We were asked so many questions about the CBP One app. People were trying to use it, couldn't get an appointment. There are tons of glitches, as you've all heard. Some people with dark skin were having trouble actually being able to register for the system. Many people don't have phones. Asylum seekers, we spoke to many families who had been robbed of their phones or didn't have one to begin with. In some cases, there was a need for internet access. People were walking around struggling, trying to get sufficient internet access to be able to actually use the app. And the other problem is that the number of appointments are really small. When you look across the border, and you have asylum seekers who've been waiting and waiting for weeks and months, and it's in the U.S. interest for people to actually go to ports of entry and seek asylum there if possible. I stress also, though, that it's so important for there to be access to asylum for people who can't use and access CBP One. Not everyone can. There are people who don't speak languages that are used by the system, and as I mentioned, there are people without phones. We've got to make sure that our ports of entry are operational and that there's ways for people who are seeking asylum who don't have to have CBP One appointments to be able to do so, and who can't get them. And asylum seekers from Mexico, there are asylum seekers from Mexico who have been waiting and waiting. It's the next door country, but can't get in at one of the ports of entry.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Strong from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wolf, under U.S. law, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security is, and I quote, charged with a duty to control and guard the boundaries and borders of the U.S. against illegal entry of aliens, close quote. Mr. Wolf, would it be safe to say that it is a responsibility of this role to be apprised of strategies, tactics, and methods being employed to exploit our borders.
Absolutely.
Would you also say that a great deal of time at DHS is devoted solely to briefing and keeping the Secretary informed on such matters?
Yes, there are numerous ways the Secretary stays informed about a number of things going on at the border.
Thank you. On several occasions this year, when he has appeared before Congress, Secretary Mayorkas has testified that he was unfamiliar with some of the tactics being employed by cartels at the southern border. Mr. Wolf, in what circumstance would you say it's understandable or acceptable for the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security to be unaware of what is happening at the border?
In that particular instance, I can't imagine how he's not aware of those tactics.
Is it a total failure at every level?
Again, I can't imagine why he would not know that. Just by visiting the border, talking to Border Patrol agents, and understanding that, frankly, it's just common knowledge those are the tactics.
I would think so also. Mr. Wolf, Mr. Scott, Mr. Edlow, whoever's comfortable, Secretary Mayorkas has had more than 2 years to observe the failure of his policies and either change course or resign if not allowed to by President Biden. He has done the opposite, doubling down on those policies and implementing new unlawful programs. Does this strike you as someone helplessly responding to a crisis or someone intent on policies that caused the crisis?
I believe he's very committed to his policies, and I don't mean to be out of order, but I'd like to comment on your last question for the Secretary.
Please do.
I put in writing as the Chief of the Border Patrol what those tactics were in a memo that went through Acting Commissioner Troy Miller, and it was addressed to Secretary Mayorkas. It's clearly outlined, and that was while I was still Chief of the Border Patrol.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I appreciate that. And I want to come back to you with this question. Why would the Department of Homeland Security Secretary oppose the construction of more border wall system, especially when Border Patrol agents routinely say it's an important part of the toolkit?
Because the President campaigned on no more border wall.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, since you're here, and I want to thank you again for coming back before us. I know I've met you several times. During the Trump administration, the big thing that I saw whenever you were there, Border Patrol apprehended, processed, and by ICE Air returned these illegal aliens to the country of their origin. What message did this send when you were there to those seeking to enter America illegally?
That is a huge deterrent. A couple of things happen, I think, and we keep talking about gotaways, but what people aren't really understanding is that every gotaway and then every person released into the United States does exactly what you would do. They call home and they tell their family and friends where they're at, they check in. Their friends and family hear that message gets out. When we put people, and then more come. When we put people on airplanes and they show up back in the home country after expending all these resources, they have horror stories about the trip, unfortunately, but they chose that trip. But they tell those stories and then they see them back home. And that has a huge deterrent effect. That actually saves people's lives because people choose to stay where they're at and make things better as opposed to put themselves in the cartel's hands.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf, Secretary Mayorkas has apparently turned off all the fiber optic sensors embedded in the border fence that was built during the Trump administration to allow the Border Patrol to detect when and where people are trying to either climb the fence, which is not easy, or cut through the fence with welding equipment. Do you believe Secretary Mayorkas has played a role in directing the Department of Homeland Security to halt the completion of lights, post-construction, and/or turn off the fiber optic sensors embedded in existing fences?
So I can't think of a reason why you would decommission or turn off capabilities that are already installed. The border wall system is much more than just that physical infrastructure. Lights, camera, roads, physical access, all the things that Border Patrol agents need to do their job. Why you would turn those off, it's beyond me. I can't even think of a reason why you would do that.
Thank you. And with 8 seconds left, I know it was mentioned that illegals don't have internet access. I want to let everybody know that there's counties in Alabama that don't have internet access also. We need to work in America to solve that problem. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Ezell from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fentanyl poisoning is now the largest leading cause of death for Americans 18 to 49. As a 42-year law enforcement officer and a sheriff, I saw the devastating effects of young teenagers and young adults dying as a result of this, and it's heartbreaking. The death toll continues to climb. The rising power of the Mexican cartels continue to grow, and this low-cost manufacturing of a drug is terrible to this open border. Mr. Scott, do you believe the current fentanyl crisis is a consequences of Mr. Mayorkas' open board policy?
I believe that in part it really is, and I want to highlight some misinformation. People keep talking about seizures as if it was the total. More fentanyl is seized at the ports of entry than in between the ports of entry, but it's because CBP officers are there doing a fantastic job. They're ready to greet everybody every day. We're leaving hundreds of miles of border open every single day, no one patrolling it, but yet Border Patrol is still catching fentanyl between the ports of entry. The metric needs to be how much is available in our cities, and there's no shortage.
Mm-hmm. In your role as Border Patrol Chief, how you have seen cartels, tell us how you have seen the cartels capitalize on the border crisis and use the surges for migrants to smuggle their narcotics.
So historically, the cartels have used any distraction they can. And honestly, a lot of people have a hard time picturing this. So just think of sports. You fake a play to the right, you run the real play to the left. That's what the cartels have done. They've always done it, they've always tried to do it. When you've seen in El Paso, a young child, I think the last one was basically like a several-month-old child being dropped over the fence in plain sight of cameras where they know it's going to be viewed, that's because they know agents are going to prioritize taking care of that baby and they can push something else through. They now, unfortunately, we've given them millions of distractions. We've given them, right now, 3,500 distractions a day that the Border Patrol is having to go deal with so that they can bring anything they want in. It's lowered their overhead, it's lowered their risk, and it's a direct impact on the ability to get narcotics in cities in the U.S. and other threats.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf, last year, 850 migrants died at the border. This is the highest ever recorded. The average under the Trump administration was 280. If this is the case, why does the Biden administration continue to tout their immigration policies as safe, humane, and orderly?
I'm not sure I have a question or an answer for you, Congressman. The amount of deaths that are increasing in that desert and along that river are a factor of the amount of people coming across the border. We're seeing a huge spike, right? So we were at 10,000 a day. For a long time, we were at 7,000 a day. We're still at 3,500 to 4,000 a day, right? You only have to go back to Secretary Jay Johnson under the Obama administration that said 1,000 a day is a bad day for the Border Patrol. We're in crisis mode. We're still at 3,500. So this idea that somehow we have retracted from 10 and that's we should pat ourselves on the back and say, good job, you're still losing the ballgame in a big way. And so I think that is something we need to look at.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Wolf, I keep thinking about these words, safe, humane, and orderly. Do you believe that Secretary Mayorkas has been honest with the American people?
I don't. Not only on those words, but when you talk about the border secure operational control, he talks about putting people in expedited removal. He knows what that means. The staff of this committee knows what that means. None of those individuals will likely be removed. All they have to do is claim asylum, and they are pulled out of expedited removal. So he uses terms like these for the American people to try to explain away what's going on along that border. But those that work in the department know immigration. They know something else. And so if you're a Border Patrol agent and you hear these words, and you're saying, your political leadership is saying, look, I'm removing all these folks under expedited removal, you know that's not the case.
Mr. Scott, could you add anything to that?
I would agree to that 100%. The words very rarely match the actions. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Burkeen from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Secretary Mayorkas swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. He swore that oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the Constitution. He did not swear an oath to support this administration's policies. And by this majority membership's count, Secretary Mayorkas has chosen to ignore or refuse to enforce over 10 different federal laws, and this is a dereliction of duty and a violation of his oath. The rule of law, which is a term that's thrown around oftentimes by members of Congress, it means that nobody's above the law. It means no member of the Congress, it means no member of the judiciary, it means no Secretary of Homeland Security. The rule of law matters. What the Constitution and what federal law dictate matter. Speaking about the rule of law, Margaret Thatcher once said, any country or government which wants to proceed towards tyranny starts to undermine legal rights and undermine the law. President JFK, John F. Kennedy, once said, certain other societies may respect the rule of force of law. We respect the rule of law. Barack Obama, former president, said one of the challenges of a democratic government is making sure that even in the midst of emergencies and passions, we make sure that the rule of law prevail, prevail. So I want to talk about the federal law, and I want to talk about the areas that have been violated. Section 103A5 of the Immigration and Nationality Act says that he, speaking of Mayorkas in his position currently, shall have the power and duty to control and guard the boundaries and borders of the United States against illegal entry of aliens. Mr. Scott, how is Mayorkas violating this?
He's not even trying. So all you have to do is look at his words, any public statement. He continually talks about creating pathways for more migrants to come to the United States. CBP One app is nothing more than an invitation worldwide without any immigration documents or any right to come to the United States. You've never heard him once support any initiative the Border Patrol put out that actually allows them to increase their situational awareness and be able to stop the flow. He even disciplined agents for trying to stop the flow.
Mr. Wolf, I'm going to read something, throw this to you. On May 10th, the reporter immigration analyst Todd Bensman reported ahead of the expiration of Title 42 that Mexican immigration officials were informing him they were coordinating with DHS personnel on the other side of the border to move illegal aliens from the Mexico side of the Rio Grande to the American side. In other words, Mexican DHS officials were helping illegal aliens cross into the United States. This would violate Section 274 of the act we just cited, which prohibits aiding and abetting illegal immigration or helping someone enter the country illegally. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's concerning. Look, Border Patrol agents are in a difficult position. When they see hundreds of folks coming across that river, they want to make sure that they're safe and secure. But at the same time, they should not be facilitating that either. So my guess is those decisions had some buy-off from leadership somewhere in the department.
They would have to.
Yes.
They would have to. No one would take that upon their authority without Mayorkas knowing about it. Mr. Wolf, Section 212 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, also just mentioned beforehand, says that parole can only be granted on a case-by-case basis, a temporary basis for an urgent humanitarian reason, significant public benefit. How is Mayorkas' mass release of illegal aliens into the interior violating this U.S. law? And where is he deriving the authority to violate the clear language of the statute?
So we use that authority very differently. Urgent humanitarian need is if someone needs to come into the United States for a medical procedure of some kind. You allow them in, and then obviously you remove them as well. For a significant public benefit, you want to parole someone in to probably testify at a criminal trial. You parole them in, and then you ask them to leave. What you don't do is parole 360,000 individuals a year from 4 different nationalities, regardless of who you are, regardless of what you do. The simple fact that you come from that country, that you are somehow granted parole. I think it's interesting that those individuals are not being put in the asylum system. So the administration is either signaling that they don't qualify for asylum or the system's broken, which we know it to be. Instead, they're paroling them in, which is a different set of benefits. Again, it's a little bit of a shell game that they're using.
Is he adhering to federal law?
I don't believe he is.
No. And last question, Mr. Scott. Article 4, Section 4 guarantees to every state a Republican form of government and to protect those states against invasion. 5 million people, more than the population of Oklahoma, have come in illegally under the Biden administration. Do you believe that he is violating the Constitution, Article 4, Section 4?
I believe what we have at the southwest border currently is an invasion, but for a slight different reason than most people understand. The illegal aliens themselves may not be the invader, but they are being used by a cartel that has nation-state power. People don't understand the power of the cartel in Mexico, the influence they have on the government, the weaponry they have is equivalent to many, many countries. And that cartel is using this massive illegal immigration every day to invade our country, the sovereignty of it, and to pose real threats. And through fentanyl alone, which is only one of the things they smuggle, they've killed more Americans than most wars. It's an invasion.
Thank you. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Crane from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it interesting that many of my colleagues continue to talk about how Republicans screaming about open borders is causing this invasion. I want to ask a couple of the panelists, were any of you guys paying attention back in the presidential campaign back in September 2019 when then candidate Joe Biden said, we're a nation who says if you want to flee and you're freeing oppression, you should come? Mr. Wolf, did you hear that?
I did.
Mr. Scott, did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Edlow?
I'll be honest, Congressman, I wasn't paying attention at that point.
Darn it, Mr. Edlow, you broke the streak. Ms. Acer, how about yourself?
Words, but certainly I've heard President Biden speak positively about the importance of seeking asylum.
What do you think, Mr. Wolf, what kind of message do you think that sends to people that might want a better life?
Well, I think it sends the message that the borders are open. Now is the time to come. If I'm elected, there's going to be a new security regime along those borders, and I think that we saw the results of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to double tap on that because that is a massive part of the causation here. Next, I find it interesting as I sit in this chamber and I continue to hear political theater, this is all political theater. I want to go through some of the political theater that we continue to hear. 4.8 million encounters at the southwest border, 1.3 million known gotaways, 69 individuals just this year on the terrorist watch list, 71,238 fentanyl deaths in 2022. Does that sound like political theater to you guys?
It does not.
No, it's not. How about this? Border town's only hospital running out of resources on the brink of collapse, caring for migrants, Yuma, Arizona, in the state that I represent. Does that sound like political theater? That's the problem. These are real lives. These are real issues. This is real infrastructure that is being overrun. This isn't political theater. The reason we continue to scream about it is because our colleagues don't really seem to care. And quite honestly, the American people sends us, congressmen and women, representatives to represent them up here in Washington, D.C., and they are feeling the causation of these policies. They are feeling the causation of this plan. I want to also go into the political theater of what the American taxpayer feels. $182 billion reported to cover the costs incurred from the presence of illegal aliens. That's $1,156 every year per taxpayer. Is that political theater? Do people feel that, Mr. Wolf?
I believe they do feel that, and I think the most concerning thing is it's all avoidable.
Absolutely. What about you, Mr. Scott? Do you think that American taxpayers feel that?
Spent most of my career along the southwest border. I work with Texas a lot right now, and they're double paying for border security. It's a resounding yes, and it's completely avoidable.
Absolutely. How about 5 suspected MS-13 gang members in U.S. illegally charged with murder and death of Maryland 15-year-old? Is that political theater? California, MS-13 gang member accused of 10-year-old's torture and murder. How about that? Political theater? How about this one? 5 MS-13 gang members who killed Virginia teenagers sentenced to life in prison. Washington Post. More political theater that we have to continue to scream about because nobody on the other side is listening. This administration continues to ignore it. You know, one of the most interesting things, because I'm the last person that gets to question anybody. Mr. Scott, I heard you testifying. How many administrations did you serve under, sir?
I was in the Border Patrol for about 6. I was in leadership positions in 5.
Right. And, you know, you said something that really struck me as somebody who's been in the military before. You said that when you actually, and members of your team actually brought up deterrence on phone calls with this secretary, that you guys were shut down immediately.
Correct, face-to-face, transition teams, phone calls, the entire time.
That seems really odd, sir. It doesn't sound as if this secretary wanted to hear what could stop these 71,000 fentanyl deaths, what could stop these hospitals from getting overrun, what could stop these children from getting murdered by MS-13 gang members, does it?
No, we were prevented from talking about border security or threats at all.
And the last thing I want to say, Ms. Acer, I know you've spent a lot of your life trying to help migrants, right? I read your bio. And I think a lot of Americans can identify with that and even appreciate it. What they don't appreciate is that your concern and care does not seem to extend to them whatsoever. That's a problem. And ma'am, I want to ask you one question. Has your organization ever taken money from the Soros Foundation?
Excuse me?
The Soros Foundation. Have
Yes,
you ever?
yes. We've received money from multiple foundations over many years.
You know how much money you guys have taken from the Soros Foundation?
No, I do not know how much money we've taken in from any foundation, and I just am really troubled if you're somehow picking on one particular foundation. There's a long history of the Soros Foundation being targeted for anti-Semitic reasons.
That has nothing to do, ma'am, with why we have an issue with it. Everybody knows that George Soros is a globalist and uses his money to often destroy the very things that protect Americans, our way of life, and our freedom. That's exactly why I asked you the question. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. We have a member, an at-large member who has, and we, of course, sought unanimous consent at the beginning to allow her to be here. Ms. De La Cruz, you are recognized from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for hosting this meeting today and for allowing me to wave on today to this important hearing. I'm Congresswoman Monica De La Cruz, and I'm here on behalf of my constituents, on behalf of the RGV Border Patrol sector, the brave men and women who serve and defend this country. You know, Texas 15 is right along the border in South Texas. It includes McAllen, Texas. And over the last several years, I have seen the other side of the aisle, the current administration, demonize our hardworking Border Patrol agents. Not only demonize them, but cripple them with lack of resources, not only on the technology side, but lack of resources from being able to put current policies in place and do their job, which is to protect this country. But yet they get up day after day and still go to their work, long hours. And when I think about those brave men and women, I not only think about them, but I think about their spouses and their children. Because the stories that you don't hear are the stories about how these men and women, when they go and pick up children who've been abandoned, because the cartels, they just leave these children on lands. Children at the age of 1, at the age of 2, of 3. Our Border Patrol men and women are carrying these babies. They're helping women to give birth on the banks. The reason that I came today and asked to be waived on is because they need a voice. They need a voice to stand up for them, to show them that the people in Congress care. Well, at least some of them. Because when we look at this room, I can see people on the other side of the aisle are not here to see what the crisis is at our borders, to see our national security and how there is a lack of security due to this administration. That being said, I want to say that Chief Scott, you were here under the previous administration, and my understanding from speaking to my friends in Border Patrol in the RGV sector is that you put together many processes and put them in place in order to be able to facilitate the immigrants coming through and how to properly put them through the borders. That being said, there were various executive orders under the previous administration that seemed to work. Can you tell me how the executive orders from the previous administration and the executive orders from this administration have changed?
During the last administration, and the Trump administration gets labeled with a lot of this, but under Secretary Wolf's guidance and others, we put together integrated teams, and we had a simple question put in front of us. Literally every week, we had to go back to the White House and give it answers. What can we do to secure the border and protect America? In all the EOs that went in place, MPP, the asylum cooperative agreements, I was sending Border Patrol agents to countries down south, left and right, to build relationships with them and just simply get them to enforce their own laws. It was all about protecting America. And then on January 2021, everything switched. Every one of those policies that actually showed progress and improved and protected America was replaced with messages that said, speed up the processing as fast as you can. We're not into the deterrence business anymore, and we need to find new ways to get more migrants into the United States.
So do policies work?
Policies do work. Rhetoric works short time, but policies and actions work long term. And I believe Mr. Edlow is really a key into some of those policies, and he may have
And before I go to you, let me ask you one last question. Mr. Scott, how many people did you personally parole into this country?
So while I was chief of the Border Patrol, that authority was delegated to sector chiefs, and not to try to get out of it, but because that's how much we cared about it. There's 20 sector chiefs nationwide. So when I was a sector chief, in a year, I think the most paroles I ever did was about 10. And the things that people are missing is there was a very in-depth threat assessment done with every one of those individuals. There was a plan to keep track of them. And then when whatever the reason was done, we physically made sure the person was removed to the United States consistent with the law.
That being said, how does that compare with the current administration and the amount of paroles that are let into this country?
We were using it consistent with the law, case by case, individual determination. From my understanding, the way it's being used now is just a blanket way to get people out of stations, avoid the optics of people backed up in Border Patrol stations.
And I think that's where this is of real concern, is it all goes to optics when it's convenient to the Biden administration. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize the ranking member for his closing comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had the opportunity to engage in a dialogue about what we hope we can do together. And, for me, I think today was challenging because it feels a move away from working together across the aisle on a lot of the challenges that we have to face, including the border. It's a move away from trying to come to a comprehensive approach to immigration reform. The fact that the report was issued this morning without consultation with minority, with the staff. And I want to be clear about one thing. Secretary Mayorkas has not violated the law. He and the Department of Homeland Security have been working to secure the border every day. I've been to the border twice since January. I went with a delegation of Democrats from Homeland Security. So we have an interest in dealing with this issue directly and availing ourselves of the opportunities to deal with people directly who are at the front lines. So we're not running from this issue, but we are trying to work at it in a constructive manner. If you talk about the administration, Secretary Mayorkas has increased efforts to go after smugglers. We talk about additional legal pathways to enter the United States, but that actually hurts the cartels and smugglers' business model. So by creating constructive, actual avenues for people to come here legally, it undermines what the cartels are trying to do at the border. And the numbers are what they are. Encounters at the border are down. We don't all have to agree with the administration's policies, but the facts show that they are, in fact, effective. I do hope that in the future we can have real substantive discussions on the threats facing our nation. It's critically important that we do so. I hope we can do so under different circumstances, and I look forward to doing that work because we are here to create solutions for all of our constituents, and I look forward to those days. I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and recognize myself for a few closing comments. First, I just want to reiterate that we're looking at a cause and effect. And the cause is policies that we're working. You can look at the numbers that were coming in. And those policies were thrown away. Migrants listened to the president about granting asylum and all of this stuff, granting, permission to just basically come into the country, and they came, and they tested the system. And those who got here made phone calls back home, and the wave of people started. This notion that a migration crisis has occurred and we're responding to it is wrong. We created a migration crisis by creating an incentive for people to come here. We opened our border, people tested it, and they called home, and now more are coming. Not hurricanes, not earthquakes, not changes to our immigration law, not changes to the budget at CBP, not changes to the number of Border Patrol agents. What changed were policies. And it has created a mass migration wave from 160 countries of people coming to the United States. Tragically, the drug cartels have taken advantage of this. They seized on the opportunity to use people, to pay them up to $13 billion, transferred to some of the most heinous people. We've seen the images. We've seen the videos of them burning human corpses they've executed. Yet, we're trying to find, some excuse for this. The cause and the effect is policies and a mass wave and cartels who are manipulating the situation. Add to that the tactics and strategy of the cartel to overwhelm Customs and Border Patrol with mass waves of people, thinning of the line in order to process, frees up the cartels to come right across the border in their carpet shoe wearing backpacks full of fentanyl, and we've seen the piles of the backpacks in Arizona and Texas. The effects. Americans are more unsafe, period. And all you have to do is look at that little baby from France who was visiting the United States, crawling around on a VRBO carpet, and encountered fentanyl left from someone before. And that baby died. How many Americans take their kids to the hotel? How many Americans go to a VRBO and say, you don't know if you're safe? In the United States of America, because of the policies of this administration and this secretary. We know that rapists and murderers have been released, and that's not counting the population of the gotaways. We've got percentages in the folks that have turned themselves in. Why would you be a gotaway, by the way, if you're just here to get in for economic purposes or even asylum? Why, just turn yourself in and you'll get released into the country. Why would you be a gotaway? 1.5 million of them in the United States now. What percentage of that 1.5 million are murderers or rapists or drug dealers or cartel members? Mr. Mayorkas can't answer that question. We're going to have Mr. Mayorkas back here, but no one can answer that question. Americans are unsafe because of this open border. National security, 200 plus terrorists versus 11. That tells you that the terrorists are trying harder and harder to get into this country because they know the policy, that the door is open. National security. This chart is incredible. You look at the past several years, there's not much statistical difference in those years, but suddenly in this year, look at the Chinese nationals pouring into this country. And we have reports from sector chiefs saying they're PLA associated. They're taking a lesson from the Russians who infiltrated Ukraine before they invaded. Now, it's not to say that the Chinese are going to invade the United States, but if we were to defend Taiwan, think about what those people might become. It's interesting to think about. But Mr. Mayorkas can't guarantee us what they are. They're just being released into the United States. That's a national security issue. Migrants separated. We're talking 85,000. I understand the phone call system. That means there were some, whatever the number is, and probably in the thousands. And oh, by the way, the New York Times, not known and in the report, not a Fox News, not a Newsmax, the New York Times went and found some of those people, found they were stacked in homes as much as 20 and were being used in forced labor. should never happen in America. It happened because Mayorkas' decision, a dereliction of duty as far as I'm concerned, waived the background checks on those individuals. It's unconscionable. It's been discussed, the financial costs too, not just the human costs, an effect. And it will cost us. It is costing us. Your health insurance is going up because of the uncompensated care at the ER, period. Why? Because 7+ million people. Mr. Mayorkas broke the law. We've had witnesses cite the law, read the law, and describe the methodologies which he's either subverting it or breaking. He's refused to abide by at least 2 court orders. Fact. He made it lawful to enter the country in lawful pathways that don't exist in the law. That's breaking the law. That's violating the law. And he clearly lied to Congress. Chip Roy showed him the definition of operational control. He said, yes, according to that definition, we have operational control of the border. And then in the Senate, after Ortiz made his comment, he admitted no one's ever had control by that definition, admitting that he lied when he was in front of the committee with Chip Roy. A Secretary of Homeland Security, a Secretary of any department in our government cannot come to the United States Congress and lie to Congress under oath, period. That is a dereliction of duty. Whether you like the fact that we're, helping people who are in need, he lied to Congress. That's unacceptable. And oh, by the way, we went back and searched the record, all the pounding on Mr. Wolf here, which will tell you something. If you're not defending your own guy and just beating up on the witness, maybe you don't have a leg to stand on. But we went back and looked at your record, sir, and we can't find anywhere where you claim to have had operational control. At least you didn't lie. He admitted his own incompetence. In the Senate, he said he did not understand the strategies of the cartels. Now, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, said, yes, that's the strategy of the cartels. The Attorney General gets it. The Secretary of Homeland Security doesn't understand the strategy of the cartel he's been asked to confront to protect Americans. That's admitting incompetence. I want to correct the record on a few things too. Asylum is the heart of our country trying to help people in need. I get it, appropriate. Abuse of asylum laws for a political purpose is wrong. And asylum is not granted to people, if you read the law, just because they're coming from a corrupt government or from a crime-ridden area or poverty. Asylum is granted when a government is pursuing an individual. The UN Charter is very clear. When a refugee is seeking asylum and they go into another country, that country is supposed to take care of them and not pass them on to another country. That's in the United Nations Charter. Why is this happening all over Central America? And why are we accepting that that's okay? We signed the UN Charter, they signed the UN Charter, let's enforce it. There's insinuations that because we want to see the rule of law in place, that we're somehow anti-migrant or anti-charity. When I ran my healthcare company, I built a not-for-profit for a lot of reasons. I wanted to hire physicians to join my company that had a heart to serve people. So we had a not-for-profit, and we paid those doctors expenses so that they could do foreign trips and we could run free clinics. I want to serve people. But the government doesn't get to pick where my charity goes. The government doesn't get to decide that Mark Green's taxpayer dollars are going to go for taking care of maybe I want to give my charity to Gold Star families. The family members of dead Americans who fought for this country. Maybe that's where I want my charity to go. Maybe I, want to plant trees and save the environment. Best vacuum cleaner for CO2 on the planet is a tree. But I'm having to pay taxes that the president gets to decide where that charity goes? No. Been an accusation today that the GOP has done nothing. We just passed a border security bill that addresses all these issues. Ms. Acer, you said that we shouldn't say that the border is open because it might incentivize more people to come. I think that's what the implication of what you were saying. I couldn't agree more. That's why we're having the migration crisis, is we opened the border. The president said it in his campaign. People come and they call, and now they're coming into the country. I agree. It creates an incentive, and you apparently do too. Immigration is not our committee. Here's another thing. Well, maybe I misunderstood you, but that's what I thought you said. But immigration is not our committee. We don't get to solve the immigration problems. People here today have talked about, hey, we got to fix immigration. Yeah, we got to fix immigration, but if you create more of an incentive for people to come, they're going to come. You have to secure the border first. You secure the border, then we'll fix immigration. I couldn't agree more on that. NGOs. Not all NGOs are bad. Not all NGOs are good. There are some that are doing great things, and there are some that are incentivizing the migration that is harming people. And there are some incentivizing people to break the law, and that's just period. And just because you're looking into NGOs, it doesn't mean that you're anti-NGO. It means you want people taken care of appropriately. We've talked about the CBP1 app and the shell game that is. We've been, accused of not addressing other issues like cyber. We have many other subcommittees that are taking actions on cyber and maritime security and other things. That stuff's all going on. You can't make the accusation that we're just here prosecuting Mr. Mayorkas. Congress has both an oversight requirement, an oversight obligation as much as it has a passing laws obligation. And oversighting this crisis is our duty. And we're not going to shirk that duty. And it is revealing that Democrats today spent far more time baselessly attacking Mr. Wolf than defending Secretary Mayorkas and his policies. If you examine the facts, there is no defense for his dereliction of duty. This is just the beginning of a lot of hearings fulfilling that duty for oversight. We will get to the bottom of what's going on at our southern border. We will characterize the costs to the American people, and we will inform them and hopefully inform the president. My hope is that the president is unaware of all this and that maybe he'll do the right thing and fire a guy who has lied to Congress, broken the laws, and facilitated this mass migration that's resulted in the harm both of Americans and of the migrants. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony today, and all of our members for their questions. As I said at the beginning, we were going to disagree. We did, but that's what this is all about. It's the sausage making, as they say. The members of the subcommittee or the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask that the witnesses respond to those in writing pursuant to Committee Rule 7D. The hearing record will be held open for 10 days for such purposes. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.